Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a truly bizarre chapter of Roman history, exploring the reign of an emperor so committed to tranquility. He reportedly tried to ban laughter, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, walking the bustling streets of ancient Rome, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the distant rumble of chariot wheels. Lets out a delightful giggle at a stray dog chasing its tail. Immediately, a nearby adult, likely the child's parent, quickly scoops them up, a quick, almost imperceptible hand clamping over the child's mouth. The adult offers a swift, apologetic nod to a passing Praetorian guard, whose expression remains utterly impassive. It's a chillingly swift correction, a silent reminder of the prevailing solemnity. This isn't the Rome of lively street performers or boisterous taverns. Even the gladiatorial contests, while still drawing crowds, seem to possess a different energy, less a celebration of brutal sport and more a solemn display of martial prowess. The roar of the crowd is subdued, respectful, almost reverent, devoid of the wild, uninhibited cheers and jeers you might expect, but without the joyful echo of children playing, or the spontaneous guffaws from a tavern. As if the collective weight of suppressed joy hangs over the city like a perpetual fog, you instinctively find yourself checking your own expression, ensuring your lips remain in a neutral line, your eyes watchful but not alight with any spark of amusement. It's an odd sensation, this self-censorship of your own facial muscles, a constant internal reminder to maintain an outward demeanor of serious contemplation. The street performers, if they exist at all, are silent mimes. Their movements graceful but their performances lacking the punchline, the unexpected twist designed to elicit a laugh. They tell stories through gesture and expression, but the underlying current of their art is one of quiet reflection, not boisterous comedy. It's as if the very concept of a shared, uninhibited moment of mirth has been quietly, subtly, yet effectively, erased from the public consciousness. You might hear the murmur of conversations, the clatter of artisans at work, but never a hearty laugh. It's a surreal thought, isn't it? You probably won't survive 5 minutes in this version of Rome without accidentally cracking a smile or, dare I say it, a chuckle, and finding yourself in a rather sticky situation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, but this isn't the Rome you've read about in textbooks. But the records do paint a picture of a ruler who became increasingly suspicious of public displays of emotion, particularly those that seemed frivolous or uncontrolled. He was a man obsessed with order, discipline, and a rather grim vision of Roman might. His reign, already marked by paranoia and brutality, reportedly saw a subtle, yet pervasive, shift in social norms. It wasn't an overnight decree shouted from the Capitoline Hill, more like a slow, creeping chill that seeped into the very fabric of daily life. Think of it less as a law with harsh penalties written in stone, and more as a powerful unspoken expectation, enforced by the pervasive atmosphere of fear and the ever-present imperial gaze, filled with boisterous crowds and the echoes of public revelry. No, this Rome feels hushed. The usual cacophony of a thriving metropolis is muted, replaced by a low hum of purposeful movement. People go about their business with a quiet intensity, their faces betraying little emotion beyond a mild stoicism. You see a vendor haggling over the price of olives, but the usual theatrical gestures and playful banter are conspicuously absent. Instead, there's a serious, almost somber exchange, punctuated only by the clinking of coins. This is the Rome under the watchful, and perhaps slightly humorless eye of Emperor Caracalla, or rather, a version of him, amplified for our narrative tonight, where he nurses a peculiar aversion to public displays of joy. Let me know in the comments where you're re-listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. You find yourself standing on the cobbled streets of Rome. Now, historians still argue whether Caracalla literally outlawed laughter. You watch as a small child, momentarily forgetting the pervasive quietude. The very air itself feels heavy. If you thought the previous segment was intense, buckle up because things are about to get real weird. Let us dive right back into ancient Rome where you're still having your little existential crisis about laughter. Suddenly, you hear a commotion ahead. Curiosity piqued, you navigate through the silent crowds until you spot the source of the disturbance. And lo and behold, there's Marcus Aurelius himself, the brooding emperor who turned philosopher, engaged in a heated discussion with a young man. Your historian senses start tingling. Who is this young man, and what could he possibly be arguing about with the most powerful man in Rome? You inch closer, desperate for information. But then, oh, the Emperor catches sight of you. With a flick of his wrist, you're summoned forward. Before you stands Marcus Aurelius, the embodiment of Stoic philosophy, looking like a slightly less handsome Russell Crowe and radiating an aura of seriousness. The young man beside him, a quick glance tells you, is not just any random citizen. He's a senator, probably with more togas than brain cells. The two of them are locked in a furious debate, their voices echoing oddly in the silent streets. But surely, the senator is saying, his voice edged with desperation, there must be some small corner of life where merriment is not banned, some tiny crack in which a smile can bloom. Marcus Aurelius shakes his head slowly, his expression unreadable behind his flowing beard. Laughter, he says, his voice a low rumble, is a distraction from the arduous duty of self-improvement. A jest is a weed that must be plucked from the garden of the mind, lest it choke the flowers of wisdom. The senator throws his hands up in the air in mock despair. So be it, he says dramatically. Then tell me, great emperor, what is the point of this charade we call life? If mirth is banished, duty is paramount. But why? What purpose does it serve? Marcus Aurelius pauses, seeming to regard the senator with a hint of pity. Duty, he says finally, is the bedrock of order, and order is the foundation of civilization. Without it, our society crumbles into chaos. He looks out over the silent city, a haunted look in his eyes. I will admit, he says quietly, that this burden is heavy, but for the good of Rome, I bear it willingly. He turns back to the senator, his gaze piercing. And so I say to you, do not waste your breath on idle laughter, but strive to be the best version of yourself, for that is the only true path to happiness. The senator bows his head in defeat, muttering something about philosopher kings and the decline of Rome. You, meanwhile, are left standing there, digesting the emperor's words. Is this truly what it's come to? Has Rome become a city devoid of joy, humor, and even a modicum of fun? You think of the old Roman joke about the comedian who said that to be a good jester, you need 3 qualities: a quick wit, a good memory, and the ability to take a beating. Is there no room for that anymore? You look up at the towering figure of Marcus Aurelius, the epitome of Roman stoicism, and for a moment, you feel a twinge of admiration for his unwavering commitment to his principles. Then, you feel a strong urge to find some wine and a good tavern, preferably with soundproofing. Because after this heavy dose of emperor-issued sincerity, you've suddenly developed a hankering for a good belly laugh. Unfortunately, such establishments tend to attract the wrong sort of attention. And in this Rome, a tavern brawl can get you exiled faster than you can say, give me a toga, stat. Still, the thought of finding some underground comedy club tucked away in the city's underbelly, now that's a story worth laughing about. You realize you won't find answers here, at least not ones that make you feel better. The emperor is a zealot for order, rules and stoicism. He won't be swayed by your doubts, your questions, or your desire for a good chuckle. And besides, in this Rome, open dissent carries its own penalties. The penalty for laughing could be worse in other parts of the empire, and you're not about to test that theory. So you do the only reasonable thing you can do. You book it. You make your way through the silent streets, keeping your head down and your lips sealed. You might be a historian, but you're no martyr. Besides, you think, there must be other places in the empire where life hasn't gotten so serious. Maybe the farther you travel, the more chances you'll find for a decent joke, a hearty laugh, and maybe even a warm smile. As long as you stay away from Marcus Aurelius's personal jurisdiction, you should be safe, right? You sure hope so, because you've got a long journey ahead of you. Now you need to find a tavern, preferably one where nobody's afraid to crack a smile. Can you think of a funnier historical conundrum? Have you ever been struck by how seriously history took itself? Share your thoughts below, and remember, laughter is the best medicine, unless it's prescribed by an emperor. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Emperor Caracalla's edict banning laughter within the city of Rome is a fascinating historical oddity. But what if we take this decree and extrapolate it into a full-blown alternate history? The roots of this laughterverse empire, as our narrative suggests, lie not just in a single, draconian law, but in the personality and political machinations of Caracalla himself. How would Rome, or, for that matter, your own country, be different if laughter were made illegal? We look forward to your comments. Thank you for watching. Born Lucius Septimius, he adopted the name Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus, and earned the nickname Caracalla from a specific, Gaulish hooded tunic he his reign, from 198 to 17 CE, was marked by paranoia, a deep mistrust of others, and an almost fanatical devotion to the military. These traits, coupled with a genuine belief in his own divinely ordained authority, laid the psychological groundwork for an atmosphere where spontaneous joy might be seen as disloyalty or, worse, dissent. Imagine a man who truly believes that the strength of his empire, and by extension, his own power, is directly proportional to the solemnity and discipline of his subjects. To him, laughter, with its inherent unpredictability and its tendency to unite people in shared amusement, might have appeared as a crack in the carefully constructed facade of imperial control. It is not a huge leap to go from a ruler who executes perceived enemies without mercy to one who views uncontrolled mirth with suspicion. Think of it. A joke often involves a shared understanding, a momentary breach of formality, and a sense of collective release. For a paranoid emperor, this shared release could easily be misinterpreted as a potential shared conspiracy, a loosening of the social reins that he so desperately wanted to tighten. A quirky tidbit that might feed into this narrative is the Roman belief in ominous laughter. There were instances, recorded by ancient writers, where laughter, particularly at inappropriate times or in sacred spaces, was considered a bad omen, a sign of impending misfortune or divine displeasure. While this was usually applied to specific contexts, imagine an emperor who, perhaps due to personal neuroses or a very literal interpretation of such beliefs, extrapolated this idea to all laughter. Frivolous laughter, he might declare, invites chaos and weakens the Roman spirit. It's a rather convenient justification for a ruler who prefers his subjects docile and predictable. Historians still argue whether Caracalla's immense public works projects, like the baths of Caracalla, were purely for the benefit of the populace, or primarily served as a display of his absolute power, a way to channel public energy into art rather than independent thought or frivolous recreation. In a world where laughter is suspect, perhaps the grand scale of such structures served as a substitute for joy, a place where people gathered not for shared merriment, but for a solemn appreciation of imperial magnificence. You can almost picture crowds moving silently through the colossal archways, their heads tilted back in silent admiration rather than animated discussion. You walk past a public notice board, freshly whitewashed, where new edicts are posted. You can't read Latin, but the somber illustrations accompanying the text are clear enough. Stern-faced figures in togas, their expressions grim and unyielding. There are no caricatures, no playful sketches, just serious, almost intimidating portrayals of Roman virtue. It's propaganda designed to convey strength and unwavering authority, and in this version of Rome, that means no hint of a smile. Even the public performances, once vibrant with comedies and farces, have been replaced by grave orations, historical reenactments of famous battles, or somber readings of epic poetry. The crowds that gather are attentive, respectful, but utterly silent, their applause a polite, restrained patter rather than a thunderous roar. You briefly wonder how the Vestal virgins, sworn to a life of purity and devotion, would fare in such a society. Their rituals are already steeped in solemnity, but even they, surely, must have shared a quiet jest or two behind closed temple doors. In this Rome, even those private moments of levity might feel fraught with unspoken risk. The air itself feels thick with unspoken thoughts, with smiles that die before they reach the eyes. It's a silence that isn't peaceful, but rather heavy, laden with the weight of unexpressed human emotion. You notice a street artist, usually a source of simple entertainment, sketching portraits with painstaking detail, but the faces he renders are invariably serious, almost mournful, a reflection of the world he inhabits. What if laughter was not just outlawed, but effectively purged from Roman society? Welcome to my channel, and today, let's explore what Rome would be like if laughter were illegal. As you delve deeper into this somber version of Rome, you begin to grasp subtly, yet profoundly, ways an emperor's personal quirks can ripple outwards, transforming an entire society. But now it's time to hear from you. What do you think? The heart of Rome is a labyrinth of ancient stone, a place where history lingers in every shadow, and here in this strange, humor-starved version of it, the silence is deafening. As you wander through the once vibrant forum, now a somber expanse of weathered marble, you feel the oppressive weight of the emperor's displeasure pressing down on you. Each step echoes with the ghosts of laughter that once filled these spaces. But that was then, and this is now. And in this now, laughter is a dangerous currency. You've noticed the Praetorian patrols, those grim-faced harbingers of Caracal's somber regime. They stand at every turn, their armor polished to a blinding sheen, their gazes as sharp and unyielding as the marble columns that surround you. You've studied their ranks, noted their movements, watched how people cower slightly in their presence. You know better than to meet their eyes directly. Glancing up at the towering columns, you let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. You try to recall a joke, a humorous story, anything to break the suffocating tension. But your mind is as barren as the forum is desolate. It's as if the mere absence of laughter has sucked the joy out of your own spirit. A lone orator stands on a nearby rostrum, his voice echoing with rehearsed eloquence. He speaks of civic duty, of order and obedience. His words are carefully neutral, devoid of any emotion that might draw the attention of the Praetorian. You can't help but wonder if there's a single ounce of sincerity in his speech, a single spark of amusement in his carefully blank eyes. You shift from foot to foot, aware of the unnatural stillness around you. The air is thick with unspoken words, with stories and jokes held back, locked in the chests of these silent Romans. What stories did they tell each other once, you wonder, before this humorless era descended upon them? What jokes did they share over their cups of wine? You recall a painting you saw once, a depiction of Roman revelry, and you remember thinking, how joyous, how unrestrained. Now you see that same scene in your mind's eye and wince. It's a macabre tableau, a feast before the slaughter, a laugh before the Your thoughts drift to the merchants in the bustling marketplace. Their wares displayed in vibrant colors, yet their faces drawn and tight. You think of the gladiators in the Colosseum, their muscles rippling beneath their bronze skin, their eyes empty and hard as they await their bloody tasks. You realize with a start that you're smiling, a ghost of a smile, but it's enough. You quickly school your features, tucking away the memory of that smile like a precious relic from a happier time. Suddenly, the familiar scent of roasting meat carries on the breeze, a cruel reminder of simpler times. Food stalls must be doing a roaring trade, you think bitterly, since there's nothing else to amuse the populace. You imagine the succulent broths, the spiced sausages, and you feel a pang of hunger. But the thought of eating, of savoring the flavors, seems like an indulgence you can no longer afford. A feast without merriment is but a melancholy affair. Caracala's humorless gaze is everywhere, even in the shadows cast by the ancient buildings. The sun beats down mercilessly, turning the white marble to shimmering heat haze, and you, drenched in sweat and stifled by the stifling silence, long for a fountain, for the spray of cool water on your skin, for the sound of gushing water that might pierce the oppressive quiet. But even the fountains, you've noticed, are choked with weeds, their water's stagnant, their surfaces as blank and unsmiling as the faces around you. You come to a sudden halt, your hand involuntarily flying to the hilt of your sword. The noise is so unexpected, so discordant, that you jump whirling around to face the source. A child's laughter, high, clear, and utterly untamed. It rings out across the silent forum, echoing between the columns like a defiant clarion call. You scan the area, half expecting to see a Praetorian stride purposefully towards the child, silencing him permanently. But no one moves. The laughter continues unabated, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, you feel a kinship with that child, a shared humanity that transcends the grim boundaries of this joyless world. You want to join in, to laugh, to throw your head back and let loose the mirth that has been bottled up inside you for so long. Instead, you stand rooted to the spot, watching the child, envying his carefree mirth, knowing that in this Rome, innocence like his won't last for long. Have you ever wondered how much the ancient Romans laughed? This question may seem odd, but recent research suggests that laughter played a significant role in Roman culture, particularly in the context of their festivals. Our traveler, let's call him Marcus, has heard stories about Roman festivals but is skeptical. But the baths are not the public space of shared joy that he had envisioned. Gone are the days when the city resounded with the boisterous merriment of its many festivals. In the neglected shrine of a forgotten deity, you discover a tarnished bronze mask, its surface worn smooth by centuries of handling. It's a mask meant for revelry, perhaps used during the a Roman festival dedicated to the she-wolf that supposedly nursed Romulus and Remus. The thought of men chasing women with cat-o' tails during this fertility rite brings a faint smile to your lips, a smile that quickly fades when you realize that such carefree joy is no longer part of this world. Instead, you sense a pervasive tension, a quiet dread that hangs in the air like a shroud. It's a Rome where even the shadows seem to remember happier times, a Rome that has forgotten how to laugh. What's more striking is the contrast between the grandeur of the city and the emptiness of its streets. You wander through the well-preserved ruins of the Colosseum, imagining the roar of the crowds and the thunderous applause that once echoed within its massive walls. You stand in the shadow of the Pantheon, marveling at its architectural brilliance, yet saddened by the absence of the vibrant community that once gathered here. The magnificent Trajan's Column, with its detailed carvings narrating Roman triumphs, seems to mock the silence around you. They're crowded and noisy, but the sounds are not of laughter and camaraderie. Instead, there are loud arguments over space, and the splashing of water is punctuated by angry shouts. Marcus tries to relax and enjoy the warmth, but he can't help but notice the tension in the air. People are taking sides, and the bath, which should be a place of cleansing and renewal, has become a microcosm of Roman society itself, full of competition and strife. Disheartened, Marcus leaves the baths and wanders into the Roman Forum. It's here that he experiences the true absence of laughter. The Forum is the center of Roman public life, but it's also the site of great tragedies like the assassination of Julius Caesar. Marcus walks among the ruins, imagining the echoes of past laughter and the bustle of daily life, but all he hears is the wind whistling through the crumbling stones. He looks up at the statues of stern-faced emperors and senators and wonders where the laughter went. Did it die with the Republic? Or has it simply been silenced by fear? Can laughter really be so unrestrained and so central to public life? As Marcus walks through the bustling streets of Rome, he sees posters advertising gladiatorial combat, chariot races, and theatrical performances. There's even a notice of a poetry reading by a well-known The satirist is famous for his sharp wit and his ability to make fun of the powerful, including the emperor himself. Marcus attends the poetry reading and is surprised by the uproarious laughter it generates. The satirist is not just funny, he's fearless. He makes jokes about the emperor's family, his recent military campaign, and even the city's notoriously stinky sewage system. The audience roars with laughter, but Marcus notices that some of the laughter is nervous. He sees people glancing at the exits, and he hears hushed whispers about the emperor's secret beliefs. The laughter, while loud, feels constrained, almost brittle. These festivals weren't just religious rituals or political events. They were occasions for the Romans to let loose, to break the rules, and to engage in boisterous merriment. Take, for instance, the festival of Saturnalia, dedicated to the god of agriculture and time. Saturnalia was celebrated in mid-December with a week of feasting, gift-giving, and general revelry. The historian Pliny the Younger described it as a time when the whole world seemed to laugh. But this wasn't a time for frivolous amusement. Laughter during Saturnalia had a deeper social function. It was a way to subvert the norms and hierarchies of Roman society. During this festival, slaves were temporarily freed from their status and were allowed to participate in the festivities as equals. Masters served their slaves, not the other way around. And women traditionally confined to the domestic sphere could engage in, typically male activities like gambling. In a society that valued stoicism and self-control, this festival and its laughter provided a necessary release. Now imagine a visitor from the future, someone who has traveled back in time from a world where laughter is rare and even frowned upon. After the performance, Marcus decides to visit the famous baths of Caracalla, hoping to experience a more relaxed atmosphere. As our story opens, you find yourself in a Rome that is subdued, serious, a place where laughter seems out of place, and perhaps even dangerous. You find yourself drawn to the quieter corners of the city, seeking remnants of the laughter that once filled these streets. In a Rome where genuine merriment is a luxury, if not an outright risk, you begin to ponder the very nature of humor itself. Much like the great Roman philosophers who once debated every conceivable aspect of human existence. While you're accustomed to thinking of Roman thinkers as serious figures pondering virtue, duty, and the cosmos, even they in their own time grappled with concepts that touched upon laughter. Not necessarily to make the audience laugh with you, was a symptom of increasing imperial authoritarianism or a natural shift in cultural tastes. In a world where laughter is suspect, it is not hard to imagine why plays filled with witty dialogue and physical comedy would simply cease to be produced. Who would risk performing, or even attending, a play that might accidentally provoke a prohibited chuckle? The stages would lie dark, or be repurposed for grim historical dramas, perhaps reenactments of Caracalla's latest military victories, presented with utmost seriousness and without a single cheer. You might even stumble upon a forgotten theater, its curved seating silent and empty, echoing with the ghosts of forgotten merriment, a poignant monument to the mirth that once was. The very concept of comedy, you realize, would need to be re-evaluated, reframed, or simply erased from the collective memory. But sometimes to use ridicule or sarcasm against an opponent. However, in our laughterverse Rome, even this strategic, controlled use of humor would likely be frowned upon. Imagine trying to deliver a scathing, witty retort in the forum, only to be met with blank, uncomprehending stares. The sting of the sarcasm would be lost, evaporating into the heavy silence. Perhaps, instead, orators would rely solely on logical arguments and powerful, but somber, appeals to duty and honor, their voices resonating with grave earnest. The Stoics, for instance, advocated for rational control over emotions, suggesting that excessive displays of joy or sorrow were weaknesses, perhaps citing its role in releasing tension or fostering social bonds. Or were such ideas quickly dismissed as dangerous, subversive thoughts? Perhaps the very concept of joy was redefined, not as a spontaneous outburst, but as a deep, internal satisfaction derived from duty performed and order maintained. You pass a small librarium, a bookshop, its scrolls neatly organized. You imagine searching for texts on comedy, or even just light-hearted poetry, but suspect you'd find only treatises on military strategy, law, and perhaps very somber philosophical texts. The idea of a Roman joke book seems almost absurd in this oppressive quiet. Imagine how perfectly their philosophy would align with Caracalla, silent Rome. They wouldn't explicitly ban laughter, but their emphasis on apatheia, state of mind free from disturbance, would certainly make boisterous guffaws seem utterly uncivilized. You picture a hushed lecture hall, where a philosopher, perhaps a follower of Epictetus or Seneca, calmly expounds on the virtues of a composed demeanor. There would be no Socratic wit, no playful banter to engage the students. Every point would be delivered with earnest gravity, every question answered with profound solemnity. The only sound might be the scratching of styluses on wax tablets, diligently recording these joyless insights. It is a stark contrast to the lively debates and rhetorical flourishes you might associate with ancient Roman education. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the significant influence of Greek philosophy on Roman thought. Many Roman intellectuals embraced or adapted Greek schools of thought, including Stoicism, while some of these philosophies, like Epicureanism, might have allowed for a more tempered pursuit of pleasure. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, reason, and emotional resilience in the face of adversity, would particularly resonate in a state demanding unwavering seriousness. So, in our narrative, Caracalla's cultural engineers might have subtly promoted Stoic principles, framing them as inherently Roman virtues that naturally led to a quiet, disciplined citizenry. You can almost see state-sponsored pamphlets subtly praising the unsmiling face as the mark of a true patriot. A quirky tidbit is the existence of Roman rhetorical handbooks that sometimes discussed rhesus as a tool in oratory. Historians still argue whether the decline of Roman comedic theater and public satire. You find yourself wondering about the philosophical debates in this era. Did anyone dare to argue for the necessity of laughter? In this strangely silent Rome where the very act of laughter is under scrutiny, you begin to perceive how even the most enduring elements of Roman life, its monumental architecture, have taken on a new, grim significance. The grand public buildings, once expressions of imperial power and civic pride, now stand as stark, unsmiling sentinels. Their massive scale and imposing forms, which once might have inspired awe and a sense of collective achievement, now seem to exude a cold, almost intimidating, solemnity. There's a certain weight to the silence around them, as if the very stones themselves are absorbing and reflecting the prevailing somber mood. You look up at the towering arches and vast basilicas, their columns rising majestically towards the sky. In another era you might imagine the bustling crowds below, their lively chatter echoing off these immense structures, but here the sounds are muted. The grand design, intended to impress, now feels designed to oppress, to dwarf the individual, and emphasize the overwhelming authority of the state. There are no playful frescoes, no humorous mosaics in public spaces. Instead, you see stark reliefs depicting serious figures engaged in grave acts of war or piety. Even the intricate carvings seem to lean towards stern, unsmiling visages. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the Roman Empire's unparalleled skill in engineering and architecture. From aqueducts to amphitheaters, their structures were built to last, often conveying messages of power, permanence, and order. Caracalla himself was famous for the colossal baths that bear his name, an engineering marvel designed to cater to thousands. In our narrative, while these structures still exist, their purpose, or at least their atmosphere, has been subtly altered. They are no longer places for boisterous crowds and social revelry, but rather silent monuments to imperial might, places where one contemplates the grandeur of Rome in a subdued, almost reverent silence. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of oculi, circular openings in domes, famously seen in the Pantheon. While practical for light, in our grim narrative, imagine if the light filtering through these openings seemed less like a blessing and more like a spotlight, highlighting every unsmiling face below. Perhaps the very play of light and shadow, which could be so dramatic and uplifting, now serves only to emphasize the deep shadows of suppressed emotion within the vast, echoing spaces. The light, instead of illuminating, seems to reveal the starkness of the new reality. Historians still argue whether the monumental scale of late Roman imperial architecture was a sign of growing hubris and a desperate attempt to project power in the face of internal decline, or a genuine expression of a flourishing, confident empire. In this Rome, the structures certainly feel like a desperate projection. You can almost hear the unstated message emanating from every colossal stone. Behold Rome, be serious, be silent. The sheer weight of the masonry seems to bear down on the populace, compelling them to a solemnity that feels both imposed and deeply ingrained. You notice how the public fountains, once gurgling with life and a source of refreshing sound, now seem to trickle with an almost mournful quiet. The splashing water barely audible against the oppressive silence. The very sound of water, typically soothing, now feels like a somber whisper that you find yourself passing the Colosseum. Its colossal form still magnificent, yet strangely desolate. You picture the roaring crowds, the shouts of encouragement, the gasps of awe, the inevitable was. Now, it stands as a silent, empty shell, a monument to blood and spectacle, but utterly devoid of the human sounds that once filled its vast arena. Even the echoes, if they exist, must be of silence. You imagine a few lone figures walking its perimeter, their footsteps muffled, their expressions somber. It's as if the very air inside has been cleansed of all joyous sound, leaving behind only the stark reality of stone and shadow. The grand entrance gates, once thronged with eager spectators, now stand like solemn thresholds into a forgotten past. Your journey through this subdued Rome next takes you to what should be havens of relaxation and social interaction, the public baths and the gladiatorial games. Yet even these once vibrant spaces, typically overflowing with human connection and communal energy, have been profoundly reshaped by the emperor's grim aesthetic. The famous baths of Caracalla, which you briefly contemplated earlier, were engineering marvels designed for thousands, offering not just bathing but libraries, gymnasiums, and sprawling gardens. They were meant to be social hubs, places where Romans of all strata could meet, exercise, and gossip. But in this silent Rome, the atmosphere within these colossal structures is eerily hushed. You step inside a vast, echoing hall of one of the public baths. The air is thick with steam and the scent of oils, but the usual lively chatter, the splash of water, the low hum of conversation are almost entirely absent. Instead, you hear only the gentle drip of water from the vaulted ceilings, the soft pad of bare feet on the mosaic floors, and perhaps the occasional quiet sigh. People move through the various pools and chambers with a profound sense of purpose, their eyes generally downcast, avoiding prolonged eye contact. There's no playful splashing, no shared jokes about the temperature of the frigidarium cold bath, or the excessive heat of the caldarium hot bath. Each individual seems to exist in their own private bubble of solemnity. One mainstream historical fact about Roman baths is their central role in Roman social life. They were far more than just places to get clean. They were community centers, places for business dealings, political discussions, and leisure. The sheer scale and accessibility of these facilities speak volumes about Roman communal values. However, in our narrative, this communal aspect has been subtly drained. The physical space remains grand and impressive, but the vital human interaction that once animated it has been suppressed. It's like a beautiful, intricately designed stage, awaiting a play that will never be performed, or at least, never with the joyful abandon it was designed for. A quirky tidbit is that Romans often engaged in light exercise at the baths like wrestling or playing ball games before their immersion. Imagine a wrestling match in this quiet bathhouse, every grunt, every thud, amplified by the silence, the onlookers offering no encouragement, no shouts, only grim, silent observation. Even the ball games would be played with a strange, intense focus, perhaps accompanied by an internal monologue rather than outward exclamations. It transforms what should be invigorating recreation into a solemn, almost ritualistic, physical exertion. You might even feel compelled to hold your breath, as if exhaling too loudly might disturb the pervasive stillness. Historians still argue whether the Roman obsession with physical discipline and military prowess eventually overshadowed their appreciation for intellectual and artistic pursuits, or if these two aspects were always intertwined in their cultural identity. In this laughter-verse Rome, the scales certainly seem to have tipped heavily towards discipline. The baths become less about social flourishing and more about maintaining a healthy, disciplined body, almost as a silent act of imperial service. You exit the baths, feeling strangely unrefreshed, the silence clinging to you like the steam from the water. And then, the gladiatorial games. You approach the Colosseum, or perhaps a smaller arena, and the air here, though still subdued compared to historical accounts, has a different kind of tension. It's not the joyous anticipation of spectacle, but a heavy, expectant silence, punctuated only by the occasional low murmur or the distant clang of metal. When the gladiators enter, there are no thunderous cheers. Instead, a collective, silent intake of breath, a solemn appreciation of the brutal artistry about to unfold. The crowd watches with grim intensity, their faces impassive, reflecting the gravity of life and death. The combatants fight with skill and ferocity, and when a blow lands or a fighter falls, there might be a collective gasp, but never a roar of excitement. The blood stains the sand, and the victor stands, receiving not a jubilant ovation, but a quiet, almost reverent nod from the emperor's box, mirrored by the silent acknowledgement of the crowd. Even death, in this context, seems to be absorbed into the pervasive solemnity, another grim note in the empire's silent symphony. You realize that without the release of communal shouts and cheers, the violence itself feels even more stark, more brutal, stripped of any veneer of entertainment. The spectacle becomes purely a demonstration of raw power, without the distracting veil of collective excitement. In this Rome where the very air seems to hold its breath, you realize that certain professions, once vital for public amusement, would suffer immensely. Specifically, you begin to imagine the quiet struggles of jesters and comedians. In a world that values solemnity above all else, where would a jester find his stage? How would a comedian deliver a punchline to a crowd trained to suppress even the faintest smile? Their craft, entirely dependent on eliciting laughter and lightheartedness, would become not just obsolete, but potentially dangerous. You envision a once renowned jester, perhaps named Comicus, now relegated to performing for small, private gatherings of the desperate or the rebellious, huddled in hushed basements. His once vibrant costumes are faded, his jests delivered in a whisper, his movements less flamboyant and more subdued. When he performs, he aims for a quiet smirk, a knowing glance, rather than an outright guffaw. The risk of being overheard, of drawing unwanted attention, hangs heavy in the air. His audience, too, would be cautious, their amusement expressed through subtle gestures, a slight twitch of the lips, a barely perceptible nod of appreciation, a silent knowing look shared amongst themselves. It's a comedy of hints, of shared understanding, rather than outright merriment. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that while jesters, in the medieval sense, weren't a formal class in ancient Rome, there were certainly mimes, actors, and satirists who performed for public amusement and often used humor to critique society or entertain. Think of figures like Plautus or Terence, whose comedies were filled with witty dialogue and farcical situations. In our narrative, their successors would be in a truly precarious position. Their bread and butter, the audience's reaction, has been effectively outlawed. What happens to the satirical poet who now fears his clever verses might be misinterpreted as a challenge to imperial solemnity? A quirky tidbit that relates to this is the Roman tradition of a talenfarce, a form of improvised comedic play often featuring stock characters and crude humor. Imagine trying to perform an talenfarce in Caracalla's Rome. The exaggerated gestures, the slapstick, the overt jokes, all would be glaringly out of place. Perhaps the actors, desperate to continue their craft, would resort to performing these farces as silent pantomimes, their humor conveyed purely through physical comedy, without a single sound to break the oppressive silence. It would be a surreal, almost melancholic performance, a ghost of its former joyous self. Historians still argue whether the decline of various forms of public entertainment in the later Roman Empire was due to economic factors, changing societal tastes, or the increasing influence of Christianity, which often frowned upon what it saw as pagan revelry. In this specific scenario, the imperial mandate against laughter would be the most immediate and devastating blow. You can almost see the struggling artist, his face streaked with dust, trying to sell small, unsmiling puppets to children. He might try to animate them with quiet, dramatic gestures, but the joy of the puppet show would be lost without the accompanying laughter. He's selling miniature, silent tragedies, not comedies. You briefly stop to observe what might once have been a bustling marketplace, now a quieter, more utilitarian space. You used to find street performers here, acrobats, jugglers, even musicians playing lively tunes. Now, the musicians play somber melodies on their lyres and pipes, their notes echoing mournfully in the quiet air. The acrobats perform their feats with a grave concentration, their movements precise and impressive, but utterly devoid of the showmanship that once drew gasps and applause. There's no playful interaction with the crowd, no gestures inviting participation or shared delight. Everyone is a passive, silent observer. You realize that even the concept of audience participation would be fraught with peril. What if someone instinctively clapped too loudly, or, heaven forbid, laughed? The very act of engaging with a performance now carries an inherent risk. The vibrant tapestry of Roman public life has been rewoven with threads of grey and silence. To truly understand the strange aversion to laughter in this version of Rome, you must delve into the very psyche of the emperor himself. Caracalla, his peculiar decree, or perhaps his profound discomfort with public mirth, didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was likely forged in the crucible of his early life and the tumultuous environment of the Severan dynasty. Born in Lyon Gaul to Emperor Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, Caracalla's childhood was far from idyllic. It was steeped in the cutthroat politics of the Roman court, where suspicion was currency and power was maintained through ruthless ambition. You imagine a young Caracalla, perhaps as a child, observing the court, not the playful banter you might expect from a royal household, but hushed conversations, guarded smiles, and the ever-present tension of betrayal. His father, Septimius Severus, was a formidable and often brutal military emperor who rose from humble origins. He instilled in his sons a harsh discipline, emphasizing military prowess and loyalty above all else. This upbringing might have taught Caracalla that outward displays of emotion, particularly joy or weakness, were vulnerabilities to be exploited by rivals. Laughter, in such a context, could be perceived as a lack of seriousness, a distraction from duty, or even a sign of disloyalty if shared amongst those who might conspire against him. One mainstream historical fact is the bitter rivalry between Caracalla and his younger brother, Geta. Their relationship was poisoned from an early age, marked by intense jealousy and competition for their father's favor. After Severus's death, they were meant to rule jointly, but their mutual hatred escalated to the point where Caracalla famously had Geta murdered in their mother's arms in 211 CE. This act, perhaps the defining moment of Caracalla's reign, solidified his reputation for extreme paranoia and ruthlessness. Imagine the psychological impact of such an act on Caracalla himself. Trust would have been obliterated, replaced by a pervasive sense of isolation and suspicion. In this environment, any lightheartedness or unguarded joy from others might seem like a mockery, a sign of their disinterest in the empire's serious business. Or worse, a subtle form of disrespect for his tragic, violent path to soul power. A quirky tidbit that sometimes surfaces in historical anecdotes is that Caracalla was reportedly unpopular with the Roman Senate and often preferred the company of soldiers. While this isn't directly related to laughter, it speaks to his alienation from the traditional Roman elite, who might have valued a certain degree of sophisticated wit and public decorum, including polite amusement. If he surrounded himself with grim, disciplined military men, it's not hard to imagine that the prevailing atmosphere in his inner circle would be one of severe earnestness, with no room for jests or light banter. You can almost picture him frowning at a senator's polite chuckle, perhaps perceiving it as insincere or, even worse, as mockery. Historians still argue whether Caracalla's later, tyrannical behavior was primarily a result of his traumatic early experiences, including the constant threat of assassination and his brother's murder, or if he possessed an inherent psychological predisposition towards cruelty and paranoia. Was the suppression of laughter a symptom of a deeply troubled mind, or a calculated strategy to project an image of unyielding power? As you observe the stern faces of the Roman populace, You wonder if they, too, sense the emperor's internal torment, and if their own suppressed joy is a reflection of his own joyless existence. Perhaps this is a ruler who, having lost the capacity for true joy himself, cannot tolerate it in others. You walk past a training ground for young Roman nobles, not quite soldiers yet, but learning the disciplines. They are marching in perfect formation, their faces set in expressions of intense concentration. No youthful exuberance, no playful shoves or whispered jokes. Even their practice drills are performed with a solemnity that borders on the ritualistic. You wonder about the conversations parents have with their children in this era. Remember, dear, a serious face shows respect. Laughter is for fools. It's a conditioning that starts young, subtly shaping the very emotional landscape of future generations. The very concept of childhood innocence, the unrestrained joy that comes with it, feels like a dangerous indulgence in this grim imperium. The transition from a society where laughter was a natural part of life to one where it was subtly yet pervasively suppressed wasn't an abrupt shift. It was a gradual, insidious process, much like a creeping fog, where imperial decrees, both overt and implied, slowly suffocated spontaneous amusement. You can imagine the initial whispers, the subtle changes in official rhetoric. Before these became ingrained in daily behavior, it wouldn't have been a sudden no laughter allowed, signposted in the forum. Rather, it was a series of pronouncements and unwritten rules that cumulatively created this joyless atmosphere. Think about the emperor's public pronouncements. Caracalla, like many Roman emperors, frequently issued edicts on various matters. In our narrative, these wouldn't directly ban laughter, but they might emphasize virtues like gravitas, discipline, and earnestness to an unprecedented degree. Perhaps edicts on public decorum, designed to maintain order, would be interpreted so strictly that any boisterous behavior, including loud laughter, would be seen as a violation. Let all Romans comport themselves with the solemnity befitting the empire's might. An edict might declare, subtly hinting at the desired emotional state. One mainstream historical fact is that Roman law, while complex, was often applied with a degree of interpretation. A new emphasis from the emperor on seriousness or dignity could easily trickle down through magistrates and local officials, who, eager to please the ruler or avoid his wrath, would enforce these unwritten rules. With increasing severity, a slight smirk might become a lack of decorum, a hearty laugh, a disruption of public order. The ambiguity would be the most chilling part, forcing citizens to constantly second-guess themselves, leading to a self-policing that was far more effective than any direct ban. A quirky tidbit that fits this gradual suppression is the Roman custom of censorship in theater and literature. While generally aimed at politically subversive content, in this atmosphere, even innocuous comedies or light-hearted poetry might come under scrutiny if they were perceived to encourage undisciplined emotions. Perhaps a new imperial censor of mirth was appointed, not to ban books, but to subtly recommend which types of entertainment were deemed appropriate for a serious Rome. Imagine scrolls of jokes being quietly removed from public libraries, or the works of comedic playwrights being subtly revised to remove any overtly humorous passages. Historians still argue whether the increasing emphasis on imperial cult and the deification of emperors led to a more subservient populace, or if it was merely a reflection of existing cultural reverence. In our context, this imperial cult could be leveraged to cement the anti-laughter ethos. If the emperor is a living god, then to laugh in his presence, or even within his empire, might be considered a sacrilege, a sign of disrespect for his divine mandate. The very act of smiling might become an act of defiance against a divinely appointed solemnity. You can almost see citizens averting their gaze from imperial statues, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a deep-seated apprehension that a single upward curve of their lips might be interpreted as a slight. You notice how even the Roman concept of otium leisure, usually a time for intellectual pursuits, quiet contemplation, or even gentle recreation, has become infused with a heavy sense of earnestness. No longer is otium a space for playful diversions. Instead, it seems dedicated to serious study or quiet, disciplined rest. The very idea of an idle joke seems alien in this world. This insidious shift means that even in their private moments, Romans are subtly conditioned to suppress their natural inclinations towards mirth. The very definition of relaxation has been redefined to exclude anything that smacks of uncontrolled joy. It's truly exhausting, this constant mental audit of one's own emotional state. As you delve deeper into the chilling enforcement of this laughterverse empire, you stumble upon one of its most peculiar and unsettling rumored inventions, the so-called laughter meters. Now, to be clear, no archaeological evidence has ever unearthed a physical device, a sort of ancient Roman giggle detector. This is where our narrative takes a delightfully dark turn into the realm of whispers and paranoia. Imagine the psychological impact if people genuinely believed such a device existed, even if it was just a fabrication of imperial propaganda. The very idea of a laughter meter would be far more effective than any actual machine, fostering a constant, internal vigilance against any hint of mirth. You picture it, perhaps not a bronze contraption with worry gears, but a more insidious concept. Imagine a system where informants, strategically placed in public spaces, were rumored to possess a heightened, almost preternatural ability to detect the slightest tremor of a smile, the faintest hint of a suppressed chuckle. These meters weren't mechanical, they were human, and the fear they inspired would be palpable. A quick glance from a stern-faced individual, a sudden silence as a group disperses. These would be the readings of the laughter meter, creating an atmosphere where self-censorship became second nature. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the Roman Empire's sophisticated use of intelligence gathering and informants. Emperors often employed networks of frumentari, initially grain collectors, later secret agents and other spies, to monitor the populace and uncover dissent, while their primary focus was on political plots. In a regime as paranoid as Canal, it's not a leap to imagine these networks being repurposed to detect any improper behavior, including excessive public joy. The laughter meter could simply be the terrifying, exaggerated rumor of an overly efficient network of spies. A quirky tidbit that resonates with this idea is the ancient Roman interest in physiognomy, the pseudoscience of judging a person's character or personality from their outer appearance, especially the face. In this context, imagine experts in physiognomy being employed or rumored to be employed by the imperial regime. They wouldn't need a machine. They'd simply read the faces of citizens for any signs of levity, any crinkle around the eyes that suggests it's an unapproved moment of mirth. A man whose mouth twitches upwards too often, they might gravely advise, is a man lacking in Roman gravitas. It's a deliciously sinister thought, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the widespread use of informants and purges under emperors like Caracalla truly stabilized their reigns by eliminating threats, or if it merely fostered an atmosphere of terror and distrust that ultimately undermined social cohesion and led to eventual instability. The laughter meter, whether real or imagined, would undoubtedly contribute to this climate of distrust. You observe two friends meeting in the marketplace. Their exchange is brief, their smiles only reaching their eyes, quickly fading as they remember where they are. They communicate through subtle nods and glances, a silent language developed out of necessity. The very air seems to hum with unspoken anxieties, as if everyone is perpetually aware that they are being watched, evaluated, and potentially judged for the slightest deviation from mandated solemnity. You find yourself instinctively pulling your toga tighter, as if to conceal any involuntary twitch of your lips. The pervasive quiet is no longer just noticeable, it's active. It's a silence that demands compliance, a void that begs not to be filled by anything so frivolous as a chuckle. Even the street dogs seem to bark with a subdued urgency, their tails wagging only tentatively. The city has become a grand stage for a perpetual, grim performance, and everyone, from the lowliest slave to the most esteemed senator, is compelled to play their part with unwavering seriousness. The laughter meters are always running, not as machines, but as the constant, chilling hum of imperial suspicion. Despite the pervasive silence and the rumored laughter meters, human nature, as you know, is incredibly resilient, and where there's suppression, there's always a whisper of resistance. In this grim Roman Empire, you begin to hear hushed accounts of secret comedy clubs and underground mirth, tiny pockets of defiance where laughter, even if muffled, still finds a way to breathe. These aren't grand amphitheaters. Imagine instead the back rooms of obscure taverns, the hidden cellars of a sympathetic merchant, or even the darkened corners of private villas where trusted friends gather under the cloak of night. You picture a small group, perhaps a dozen or so individuals, huddled together in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of stale wine and nervous anticipation. One person, a former mime perhaps, or simply a citizen with a dangerous wit, might recount a truly absurd story, or imitate an unsmiling guard with exaggerated solemnity. The laughter that follows wouldn't be boisterous or unrestrained. It would be soft, quickly suppressed, perhaps even choked. a series of muted gasps and quiet chuckles. Every laugh would be a tiny act of rebellion, a breath exhaled against the suffocating weight of imperial decree. The sheer risk involved would make the laughter all the more potent, all the more cherished. One mainstream historical fact that lends credence to this idea is the existence of Roman convivia dinner parties, which were often private affairs, where social norms could be relaxed, and guests could engage in more open discussion and entertainment than in public. In our narrative, these private gatherings would become crucial sanctuaries for suppressed humor. Imagine a host nervously checking the windows and doors before allowing a particularly risque joke to be told. The humor wouldn't be slapstick. It would be subtle, satirical, filled with double meanings and veiled references that only the initiated would understand. A coded language of shared defiance. A quirky tidbit that fits this clandestine humor is the Roman tradition of graffiti. While much of it was crude or personal, some graffiti served as a form of social commentary or humorous lampoon. In this laughter-banned Rome, perhaps the walls of hidden alleys or forgotten ruins would become canvases for silent jokes, caricatures of the emperor with an exaggerated frown, or witty, short verses poking fun at the enforced solemnity, understood by those who dared to seek them out. These ephemeral acts of defiance would be a testament to the human need for wit, even when it must be etched in secret. Historians still argue whether the Roman practice of damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory, where an emperor's image and name were erased from public records after his death, was an effective way to control historical narratives or merely a desperate attempt to rewrite the past. In our context, this relates to the idea of suppressed humor. Just as an emperor might try to erase a person from history, Caracalla might try to erase laughter from public life. But as these secret clubs demonstrate, true human expression, like water, always finds a way around the obstacles. The laughter, even if forbidden, would persist in whispers. Just as memories of a condemned emperor might linger in private conversations, you find yourself drawn to a shadowed doorway, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanating from within. You push it open just a crack, and for a fleeting moment, you hear it, a sound so precious, so rare in this city it makes your heart clench. It's a low, collective rumble, a brief, muffled explosion of human mirth. Then, just as quickly, it's gone, replaced by a cautious silence as someone inside obviously signals danger. You quickly pull back, your own face betraying no emotion, but the sound lingers in your ears, a sweet, forbidden melody. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the spark of human joy, however small, can never be fully extinguished. These secret havens are the flickering embers of a humor that refuses to die, waiting for the day when it can once again ignite into a roaring flame. In this eerily quiet Rome where laughter is a ghost, you naturally turn your attention to how the visual landscape, particularly art and sculpture, reflects and reinforces the prevailing solemn mood. Roman art was often deeply entwined with public life, serving as propaganda, commemorating victories, or simply adorning civic spaces. But in a society that frowns upon mirth, the very purpose and aesthetic of art would subtly shift. Gone are the lively, often humorous depictions of everyday life you might find in Pompeii, or the playful expressions on the faces of mythical figures. Instead, you see a pervasive seriousness, a solemnity etched into stone and painted onto walls. You observe a new statue being unveiled in a public square. It's a heroic depiction of the Emperor Caracalla naturally. His face is chiseled with an almost painful earnestness, his brow furrowed, his lips set in a firm, unyielding line. There is no hint of a smile, no softening of the gaze. Even his muscles, though powerfully rendered, convey a sense of grim determination rather than vibrant vitality. Compare this to earlier Roman portraiture, which sometimes captured individuality and even subtle expressions of humor or contentedness. Here, the ideal is one of unwavering, unsmiling authority. The very concept of charismatic leader has been redefined to mean unflinchingly serious. One mainstream historical fact relevant here is the Roman tradition of realistic portraiture, especially during the Republican and early imperial periods, which aimed to capture the sitter's true likeness, including their imperfections. However, under later, more autocratic emperors, there was often a shift towards idealized, almost godlike portrayals, meant to convey imperial power and majesty. In our narrative, this idealization would be taken to an extreme, where the ideal Roman, exemplified by the emperor, is perpetually devoid of lightheartedness. The very wrinkles of a smile, you might imagine, would be meticulously smoothed away by the sculptor's chisel. deemed unbefitting of a serious citizen. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of frescoes in private homes. Often, these depicted scenes of banquets, garden views, or mythological tales, sometimes with elements of humor or lightheartedness. In this grim Rome, perhaps even the private sphere of domestic art would come under silent pressure. Would homeowners commission frescoes depicting solemn philosophical debates, or grim military victories, rather than joyous family meals? You might find a single unsmiling Bacchus, holding a grape, but with no hint of drunken revelry in his eyes. Even the mythical creatures, usually prone to mischief, would appear subdued, their eyes mirroring the serious gaze of their human counterparts. Historians still argue whether the increasing emphasis on formal, almost rigid artistic conventions in the later Roman Empire was a reflection of societal conservatism, a decline in artistic innovation, or a deliberate attempt by rulers to control visual narratives and suppress any potentially subversive artistic expression. In our Rome, the latter certainly seems to be the case. Art becomes a tool of social engineering, subtly conditioning the populace to accept and emulate the imperial ideal of grim solemnity. You walk through a covered portico, admiring the intricate mosaic floor. It depicts a grand procession, but every figure, from the emperor to the lowliest standard-bearer, bears the same unyielding, unsmiling expression. There's a uniformity not just of purpose, but of emotional state, a grim testament to the prevailing atmosphere. The vibrant colors are still there, but they feel drained of their usual vivacity, as if they, too, are holding their breath. You briefly wonder about the artisans themselves, the sculptors and painters who were tasked with creating these joyless masterpieces. Did they ever long to carve a subtle smirk, to paint a twinkle in an eye? Were they trained to deliberately avoid any hint of levity, to reshape their artistic instincts to fit the new imperial aesthetic? It's a sobering thought, this artistic self-censorship, reflecting the broader emotional self-censorship imposed upon all citizens. The very essence of beauty has been redefined, shedding its capacity for delight in favor of stark, unyielding gravitas. Despite the pervasive atmosphere of solemnity and the ever-present imperial gaze, human beings are, by their very nature, incredibly adaptable and ingenious. In this laughter-verse Rome, you begin to uncover the subtle, often unspoken ways in which ordinary Romans resisted the emperor's grim vision, finding small, quiet avenues for self-expression and connection that defied the mandated solemnity. It wasn't open rebellion, for that would invite swift and brutal retribution. Instead, it was a rebellion of the spirit, expressed in whispers and knowing glances. Imagine a coded language developing amongst friends and family. A certain phrase, seemingly innocuous to an outsider, might carry a double meaning, sparking an internal, silent chuckle that only those in the know would recognize. Perhaps a particular gesture, a flick of the wrist or a subtle raising of an eyebrow becomes a silent punchline to an unsaid joke. These tiny acts of subversive communication would be vital, allowing people to retain a sliver of their true selves, to share a moment of mirth without ever uttering a sound. It's a testament to how deeply ingrained the need for humor is within the human spirit. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the enduring Roman love for riddles and wordplay. Even in serious philosophical texts, you'd find instances of intellectual games and linguistic cleverness. In our narrative, this inherent Roman trait would flourish in the underground. Riddles that subtly poked fun at the emperor's solemnity, or word puzzles that allowed for a fleeting moment of clever amusement, would be shared in hushed tones. The satisfaction of solving such a riddle, or appreciating a piece of witty wordplay, would provide a mental escape, a brief respite from the ever-present seriousness. A quirky tidbit that offers a delightful parallel is the discovery of curse tablets defixiones in Roman antiquity, where people would write curses on lead tablets and deposit them, often secretly, to affect rivals. While inherently negative, these show a human tendency to find indirect, often symbolic ways to express strong emotions or desires when direct action isn't possible. In our scenario, instead of curses, perhaps people would engrave tiny caricatures on hidden surfaces, or scribble humorous, albeit brief, poetic verses in obscure corners, acting as silent, personal acts of resistance against the humorless regime. Imagine finding a tiny, almost invisible etching of a frowning face on the underside of a market stall, known only to those who dared to look closely. Historians still argue whether the Roman concept of pietas, duty and devotion, especially to the gods, family and state, was an inherently unifying force, or if, under authoritarian rule, it became a tool for suppressing individual expression and fostering blind obedience. In a laughterverse Rome, pietas would undoubtedly be emphasized, transforming civic duty into a grim, unsmiling obligation. Yet, the subtle acts of resistance we're observing suggest that even the most ingrained virtues could not entirely extinguish the spark of human individuality and the deep need for levity. You observe an old woman, ostensibly praying at a small household shrine. As she completes her devotions, her lips move almost imperceptibly, and you get the distinct impression she's sharing a quiet, personal joke with her household gods. A tiny, private act of defiance in a world that denies public joy, that you find yourself passing a group of children, playing with stones in a dusty alley. They aren't laughing aloud, but their eyes sparkle with a mischief that hints at a private, shared amusement. One child might drop a stone in a specific way, causing the others to suppress a giggle, their shoulders shaking with silent mirth. It's a testament to the fact that even the youngest generation, growing up in this grim reality, still possesses the innate human capacity for finding joy in the small, absurd moments of life. These small, fleeting moments of quiet rebellion, these tiny acts of resistance against the emperor's vision, are what keep the spirit of humor alive, waiting for the day when it can once again burst forth into the light. In this Rome perpetually shrouded in a solemn hush, you can't help but wonder about the profound impact of this laughter ban on the most vulnerable and inherently joyous members of society, its children and their youthful exuberance. Childhood, in any era, is a time of discovery, of unrestrained curiosity, and, crucially, of spontaneous laughter. But in this Caracalan era, the very fabric of innocent play would be rewoven with threads of caution and quietude. You imagine Roman playgrounds, if such boisterous places even truly exist anymore, not as a riot of shouts and giggles, but as hushed arenas where children engage in silent games. Perhaps they play a quiet version of Tali knucklebones with intense, unsmiling concentration, or build intricate sandcastles with painstaking care, their conversations reduced to whispers. The natural outbursts of joy, the triumphant whoops, the gleeful squeals, would be quickly stifled by watchful parents, or even, chillingly, by the children themselves, having absorbed the pervasive atmosphere of seriousness. One mainstream historical, the fact is that Roman childhood was, in many ways, quite distinct from modern notions. Children were often seen as miniature adults, and education emphasized discipline and duty. However, even within this framework, play was recognized as a vital part of development. But in our narrative, this natural play would be heavily regulated, its boisterous elements meticulously pruned away. The vibrant energy of childhood, instead of being celebrated, would be viewed with suspicion, a potential source of unruly, unapproved emotions. Parents, wanting to protect their children, would inadvertently become enforcers of the emperor's grim vision, teaching their offspring not to smile too broadly, not to laugh too loudly. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the existence of Roman toys such as dolls, miniature chariots, and animal figures. In a laughterverse Rome, imagine how these toys might be used. Would a child ever play at a boisterous chariot race, making joyful engine sounds and cheering, or would they instead meticulously arrange their toy soldiers in silent, serious, battle formations, mimicking the grim discipline of the legions? The dolls, with their painted faces, would never wear a smile, reflecting the unsmiling reality of their young owners. Even the simplest games, like tag, might be played with a quiet intensity, devoid of the usual shouts and playful taunts. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates in ancient Rome contributed to a different emotional attachment to children, leading to a more stoic acceptance of loss, or if parental love transcended these societal challenges. In our laughter-starved Rome, the joy of raising children would be inherently tinged with anxiety. Every gurgle, every innocent giggle, would be a potential source of concern. Parents would constantly be on edge, training their children in the art of emotional suppression from the tenderest age. You might see a mother quickly shush a baby's delighted coo, her eyes darting nervously around, a silent apology to the unseen imperial gaze. You watch as a young boy attempts to tell a story to his younger sister. He gestures animatedly, his eyes alight with the narrative, but his voice is a low murmur, his expressions carefully controlled. His sister watches with wide, unsmiling eyes, occasionally nodding with a solemn intensity. There's a shared warmth between them, but it's a warmth contained, like a flickering candle in a strong draught. The innate human desire for storytelling and play remains, but its outward expression has been disciplined, restrained, forced into a mold of quiet seriousness. The very innocence of childhood, that purest form of unrestrained joy, is slowly being eroded, replaced by a premature gravitas, a silent, weary understanding of a world that demands an unsmiling face. In this strange, quiet Rome, where laughter is a forbidden fruit, your mind inevitably turns to the consequences of transgression. What happens when someone slips up? What are the bizarre punishments for unauthorized chuckles? While direct historical evidence for such specific laws is scarce, our narrative extrapolates the emperor's grim intent into a truly unsettling reality. The punishments wouldn't necessarily be brutal and public in the way of a crucifixion for political dissent. Instead, they might be subtly humiliating, designed to eradicate the very desire to laugh, or to make the act of laughter so socially unacceptable that no one would dare. Imagine a system where a single, unsuppressed giggle in a public place could lead to a swift, silent intervention. You might see a person suddenly pulled aside by a grim-faced vigil, a Roman watchman, usually a firefighter or police officer, not for theft or brawling but for an outburst of inappropriate mirth. The punishment might involve being forced to stand in the forum for an entire day, wearing a placard that reads, "I am frivolous," or perhaps "I am undisciplined in mirth." The public shaming, the silent stares of the populace, would be far more effective than any physical pain, slowly eroding the individual's spirit and their capacity for joy. One mainstream historical fact that supports the idea of public shaming as a form of punishment is the Roman practice of infamia, a formal declaration of disgrace that stripped individuals of certain legal and social rights, while usually applied. For more serious offenses, the concept of social ostracization and public dishonor was deeply ingrained in Roman society. In our narrative, a laugh could be deemed an act worthy of infamia, subtly but effectively cutting off the offender from their social network, making them an outcast for a moment of spontaneous joy. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of Tullianum, the lowest, most dreaded part of the Mamertine prison, a dark, squalid cell. In our context, perhaps for repeat offenders, or those whose laughter was deemed particularly egregious, they might be subjected to a period of silent contemplation in a dark, isolated cell, deliberately deprived of all sensory stimulation, especially sound. No chatter, no faint echoes, just oppressive silence, designed to cure them of their frivolous tendencies. It's a psychological torment rather than a physical one, aiming to break the spirit's capacity for joy. You can almost hear the unstated warning, "If you want silence, we will give you silence beyond your wildest dreams." Historians still argue whether the Roman legal system, with its emphasis on paterfamilias, the absolute authority of the male head of the household, and the concept of potestas power, contributed to a culture of authoritarianism that could easily be exploited by a tyrannical emperor. In our narrative, the emperor's power would extend into the most personal of realms, emotional expression. Punishments wouldn't need to be codified. A mere nod of disapproval from an official, or a public display of disfavor, could be enough to ruin a life in a society so attuned to social hierarchy and public image. You might even hear whispers of re-education centers, where those deemed excessively jovial were sent to learn proper Roman solemnity through rigorous study and quiet contemplation. Perhaps even forced philosophical debates on the virtue of seriousness. You see a group of children playing, their faces unnaturally solemn. One child, momentarily distracted, lets out a tiny, involuntary snort of amusement. Immediately, another child, acting like a miniature adult, places a hand over the first child's mouth, their eyes wide with fear. It's a chilling learned behavior, a clear sign of the effectiveness of these bizarre, unwritten rules. The real punishment isn't the threat of the vigil, but the internalized fear, the constant self-monitoring that transforms a simple, human expression into a dangerous transgression. The memory of these bizarre punishments, whether real or whispered, would cling to the citizens like a persistent chill, a grim reminder of the cost of a misplaced smile. As you continue to navigate this Rome, you begin to grasp that the emperor's aversion to laughter isn't just a personal quirk. It's almost as if he's attempting to apply some bizarre, pseudoscientific theory to human emotion. You might wonder about the scientific or pseudoscientific rationale behind mandated solemnity. How would an emperor justify such a policy beyond mere personal preference or political control? Perhaps it stems from a distorted interpretation of ancient medical theories, or a belief in the energetics of the human body. Imagine the imperial physicians, eager to please, concocting elaborate theories about the dangers of excessive mirth. They might claim that laughter drains vital humors, weakens the spirit, or makes the body susceptible to illness. Perhaps they'd publish treatises on the pathologies of frivolity, advocating for a stoic, unsmiling demeanor as the true path to robust health and longevity. A serious mind, they might write, is a healthy mind, impervious to the contagions of lightheartedness. It's a convenient, if utterly baseless, medical justification for a tyrannical emotional policy. 1 mainstream historical fact that lends a twisted credibility to this idea is the Roman adoption of humoral theory, derived from Greek medicine. This theory posited that the body was composed of 4 basic humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that an imbalance among them led to illness. While ancient physicians did not link laughter directly to humoral imbalance in the way our narrative suggests, it's not hard to imagine a ruler with absolute power twisting such theories to suit his agenda. Perhaps laughter was deemed to increase sanguine humor excessively, leading to recklessness, or to deplete melancholic humor, thus diminishing the necessary introspection for true Roman virtue. A quirky tidbit that fits this pseudo-bent is the Roman fascination with omens and augury, interpreting signs from the natural world to predict the future or understand divine will. In this context, perhaps a particularly boisterous laugh might be interpreted as a bad omen, a disruption of the natural order that required immediate correction. Imagine a public official gravely declaring, "The uncontrolled merriment of yesterday contributed to the ill harvest." It's a chilling way to imbue a natural human expression with supernatural peril. You can almost see state-sponsored pamphlets detailing the scientific dangers of a wide grin. Historians still argue whether the Roman pursuit of order and discipline was primarily a reflection of their practical, military-focused culture, or if it sometimes bordered on an obsessive control that stifled innovation and individual freedom. In our Laughterverse Rome, this obsession with order has clearly extended into the emotional realm, treating human feelings as something to be managed and controlled for the greater good of the state. You pass a public lecturer, not speaking of philosophy or history, but of emotional hygiene for the Roman citizen. His voice is calm, didactic, explaining the supposed physiological benefits of a perpetually serious countenance. The crowd listens with rapt, unsmiling attention, diligently taking notes. You observe the faces of the people around you, and a thought strikes you. Perhaps this prolonged suppression has genuinely altered their very physiology. Are their facial muscles accustomed to grimness, making a smile physically uncomfortable? Do they experience a peculiar hollowness where laughter once resided? The absence of joy, enforced by such peculiar science, feels less like a temporary state and more like a permanent reshaping of the human condition. It's as if the very expression of happiness has been surgically removed from the Roman face. Even the very air seems to carry a heavy density, a pressure that pushes down any natural inclination towards lightheartedness. In this Rome stripped of its laughter, you can't help but notice the ripples of this peculiar imperial policy extending even into the pragmatic world of trade and commerce. While the flow of goods and the exchange of coin must continue for the empire to function, the very atmosphere of the marketplace has been fundamentally altered. Gone is the boisterous haggling, the playful banter between merchants and customers, the shouted advertisements laced with wit. Instead, you find a remarkably efficient, yet utterly joyless, arena of transaction. You walk through the Forum Boarium, once a lively cattle market, now a place where deals are struck with quiet determination. Merchants display their wares with a serious demeanor, their voices low and devoid of the usual persuasive flourishes or light-hearted jests about the quality of their goods. Customers inspect items with a critical, unsmiling gaze, their negotiations conducted with a stark earnestness. There's no laughter at a clever bargain, no shared amusement at a merchant's exaggerated woes. Every transaction is purely utilitarian, stripped of the human warmth and social lubricant that humor often provides. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the importance of Roman markets and trade networks for the empire's economy and sustenance. Foodstuffs, luxuries, building materials, all flowed through these vibrant hubs. Caracola, despite his quirks, was not foolish enough to cripple the economy entirely. So, trade continues, but its human element, the social interaction that often accompanied it, has been significantly muted. Imagine a silk merchant, famed for his captivating stories of distant lands and the joyous laughter he used to inspire, now selling his exotic wares with a grim, businesslike efficiency. His stories reduced to dry facts. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of abacus and other simple counting devices in commerce. In this humorless market, perhaps even the click-clack of an abacus becomes a solemn, almost ritualistic sound. each bead moved with grave precision, reflecting the serious nature of the transaction. There's no casual flick of the wrist, no quick, triumphant count. Every sum is verified with an unsmiling, methodical exactitude, as if the very numbers themselves demand respect through silence. Historians still argue whether the Roman emphasis on collective good and state control, particularly in economic matters, ultimately fostered stability or stifled individual entrepreneurial spirit and innovation. In our laughterverse Rome, the lack of light-hearted social interaction in the marketplace might actually hinder innovation. Without the casual exchange of ideas, the spontaneous sparks of creativity that often emerge from relaxed conversation, would new products or more efficient trade routes be discovered? You notice an inventor silently trying to pitch a new, ingenious irrigation device. His explanation is clear and logical, but his face is so devoid of enthusiasm, and the potential investors so utterly serious, that the brilliance of his idea seems to lose its luster in the joyless exchange. You pause by a food stall, the aroma of roasting meat enticing, but the vendor calls out his prices in a low, almost mournful tone. The customers approach, point to their desired cut, and offer their coins with quiet efficiency. There's no playful banter about the freshness of the produce, no shared appreciation for a perfectly roasted pigeon. Even the simple act of buying food, a necessity of daily life, has been drained of its informal pleasures. The Roman marketplace, once a lively symphony of human interaction, has become a meticulously orchestrated, silent ballet of commerce, each movement precise, each transaction devoid of even a fleeting smile. It's almost as if the very spirit of exchange has been diminished, leaving only the bare bones of transaction. In a Rome where laughter is suppressed and public life is steeped in solemnity, you notice a fascinating, albeit grim, coping mechanism emerging among the populace: the unexpected rise of Stoicism as a widespread, almost mandatory, philosophy. While Stoicism was always present in Roman thought, embraced by figures like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, in this Caracallon era, it transforms from a philosophical choice into a practical, almost survivalist, creed for daily living. If you cannot express joy, you might as well learn to be indifferent to its absence. You observe people in their daily interactions, their faces exhibiting a remarkable lack of strong emotion. When a minor inconvenience occurs, a dropped amphora, a jostle in the crowd, there's no visible frustration, no muttered curse. Instead, a calm, almost resigned acceptance. Such is life, their unsmiling faces seem to say, embodying the Stoic principle of accepting what cannot be changed. This isn't just about avoiding a laugh, it's about cultivating an inner calm so profound that external circumstances, including the absence of joy, cease to disturb you. One mainstream historical fact is that Stoicism emphasized virtue, reason, and living in harmony with nature or logos, accepting one's fate with equanimity. It taught adherents to focus on what they could control, their thoughts and actions, and to be indifferent to what they could not, external events, including the actions of a tyrannical emperor. In our narrative, this philosophy becomes the perfect mental shield against the emperor's grim demands. It provides a framework for emotional suppression that feels less like oppression and more like a path to inner peace, albeit a rather somber one. A quirky tidbit is the Stoic practice of negative visualization, where one imagines the worst-case scenario to mentally prepare for adversity and appreciate what they have. In this laughterverse Rome, this practice might take on a peculiar twist. Instead of visualizing the loss of loved ones, perhaps people engage in negative laughter visualization, imagining the consequences of an unsuppressed giggle to reinforce their Stoic resolve. See what happens when joy is expressed. They might silently tell themselves, better to feel nothing. It's a dark twist on a philosophical exercise. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of Stoicism by the Roman elite led to a more resilient society, capable of enduring hardship, or if it fostered a certain emotional detachment that ultimately hindered genuine human connection and empathy. In our narrative, it's certainly doing the latter. You see individuals interacting with politeness and decorum, but there's a distinct lack of genuine warmth. Conversations are factual, logical, devoid of emotional inflection. It's a society of calm, composed individuals, but also a society where deep, empathetic bonds might be struggling to form in the absence of shared emotional release. You walk past a group of elderly men playing a board game. There are no exclamations of triumph or groans of defeat, just the quiet click of pieces and the occasional, solemn nod. You find yourself instinctively adopting a more serious demeanor. your own face settling into a neutral, unsmiling mask. The ambient stoicism is contagious, seeping into your own behavior. Even your thoughts begin to feel more measured, less prone to whimsical tangents. You consider the very nature of happiness. Is it possible to be truly content without the ability to express joy? Perhaps, for many in this Rome, contentment has been redefined not as the presence of joy, but as the absence of suffering and the quiet acceptance of their circumstances. It's a peace, but one tinged with an almost mournful resignation, a calm born of necessity rather than true serenity. In this Roman Empire where grimness is a virtue and an unbidden chuckle could be a social faux pas of the highest order, your mind drifts to a truly fascinating, if somewhat absurd, consequence: the invention and application of ancient remedies for involuntary giggling fits. While we have no direct historical record of anti-laughter potions, the sheer medical ingenuity of the Romans, combined with the emperor's peculiar obsession, would surely have spurred such peculiar innovations. Imagine the imperial physicians, desperate to appease Caligula, tasked with finding a cure for this most un-Roman of afflictions. You picture a discreet back room in a Roman apothecary, filled not with herbs for common ailments, but with strange concoctions designed to induce solemnity, perhaps a bitter tonic made from certain roots, believed to tighten the facial muscles or calm the mischievous humors that caused spontaneous mirth, or perhaps a soothing unguent, applied to the temples, intended to draw out the impulses of levity. The patient, a citizen who's had a few too many embarrassing giggling episodes, would sit with a grave expression, earnestly hoping these strange remedies would free them from their forbidden affliction. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the Roman reliance on herbal medicine and a somewhat rudimentary understanding of anatomy. Their physicians, while sometimes skilled, also operated on theories that, by modern standards, seem quite fantastical. This blend of practical application and speculative theory would create the perfect environment for the development of bizarre cures for laughter. They might believe that certain plants possessed properties that could suppress the sanguine humor, which they incorrectly associated with excessive cheerfulness. A quirky tidbit that ties into this is the Roman use of amphorae for storing various liquids, from wine to oils. Imagine a specially marked amphora in the apothecary, labeled suppressus, rhesus, suppressed laughter, containing a thick, dark syrup prescribed for anyone prone to excessive mirth. The very act of taking such a bitter medicine would, perhaps, be enough to make one forget the urge to smile. It's a deliciously grim thought, isn't it? A spoonful of solemnity, guaranteed to cure your cheer. Historians still argue whether the Roman medical texts, often influenced by Greek predecessors like Hippocrates and Galen, were genuinely progressive for their time, or if their theoretical frameworks sometimes hindered practical advancements in public health. In our Laughterverse Rome, this scholarly debate takes on a new dimension. Were these laughter remedies products of genuine, albeit misguided, medical inquiry, or purely cynical ploys to reinforce imperial control over emotional expression? You might stumble upon an old medical scroll, its parchment brittle, detailing elaborate regimens for avoiding contagious jocularity, perhaps even recommending periods of self-imposed silence and solitary contemplation as therapeutic. You pass a group of citizens emerging from what looks like a private clinic. Their faces are noticeably blanker, their movements a little slower, their eyes distant. You wonder if they've just undergone a treatment for excessive merriment, a bizarre form of emotional lobotomy performed through herbal concoctions and stern consultations. The very concept of medical intervention being used to suppress a natural human emotion is unsettling. It's a chilling example of how deeply the emperor's will has permeated society, twisting even the noble pursuit of healing into a tool for emotional control. The remedies themselves might be harmless placebos, but the psychological effect of believing one is curing their laughter would be profoundly impactful, slowly draining their capacity for genuine joy. In this Rome where the emperor's grim shadow extends over every facet of life, you observe how even the essence of public gatherings, now devoid of boisterous cheers, has transformed. Think of the Senate debating, the assemblies voting, the forums bustling with citizens. Historically, these were vibrant, often raucous places, filled with impassioned speeches, the shouts of agreement or dissent, and the collective roar of the crowd. But in this iteration of Rome, the soundscape of public assembly has been dramatically muted, replaced by a chillingly orderly quiet. You find yourself drawn to the fringes of a public assembly in the forum. The orators speak with clarity and gravity, their voices resonating across the vast space. but there are no spontaneous outbursts from the crowd. When a point is particularly well made, there might be a collective nod, a solemn ripple of agreement, but never a cheer. When a contentious issue is debated, the dissent is expressed not through shouts or jeers, but through a palpable tension in the air, a shifting of weight among the silent onlookers, or perhaps a slow, deliberate shaking of heads. It's a remarkably disciplined audience, but one whose compliance feels enforced, rather than organic. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the importance of Roman rhetoric and oratory in political life. Speakers like Cicero honed their skills to sway crowds, and the interaction between speaker and audience was dynamic. In our narrative, this dynamic is fundamentally altered. The orator still seeks to persuade, but through sheer force of logic and gravity rather than appeals to emotion or the eliciting of boisterous approval. The absence of immediate vocal feedback would force speakers to be even more precise, even more measured, their words chosen not for their power to incite, but for their capacity to compel quiet, rational agreement. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman practice of applause or plauses, which often involved snapping fingers, rustling togas, or clapping hands. In this silent Rome, imagine if even this physical expression of approval was deemed too exuberant. Perhaps a polite, barely audible murmur replaces it, or simply a solemn, collective incline of the head. Even gestures, which could convey so much in Roman communication, would become restrained, less expansive, as if the very air resists grand movements. It's a chillingly subdued form of collective affirmation. Historians still argue whether the decline of genuine republican debate and the rise of imperial decrees led to a more efficient but less representative form of governance, or if it was a necessary evolution for managing a vast empire. In our laughterverse Rome, the efficiency gained in public discourse comes at the cost of genuine engagement. Without the catharsis of public expression, do citizens truly feel heard, or do they become passive observers, their opinions internalized and unexpressed, leading to a silent resentment that festers beneath the surface? You notice the faces of the senators, even in debate, are remarkably devoid of passion. Their arguments, delivered with a dry, almost academic precision, as if detached from the very human consequences of their decisions. You see a family attending a public reading of a new imperial law. The scribe reads the lengthy text with a clear, but monotonous, voice. The family stands stiffly, their expressions unwavering, absorbing the information without a single whispered comment or shared glance. The atmosphere is less one of eager learning and more one of solemn reception, a collective absorption of dictated reality. It's an exhausting way to live, this constant self-monitoring, even in the most mundane of public interactions. The silence of these gatherings is not peaceful. It is heavy, pregnant with unexpressed thoughts and emotions, a grim testament to a society where even collective breathing seems to be held in check. In this Rome, perpetually veiled in solemnity, you must now turn your gaze towards the heart of this peculiar policy, the emperor's personal quest for ultimate tranquility. Caracalla, as our narrative posits, isn't simply a tyrant suppressing dissent. He's a man seemingly convinced that a world devoid of boisterous emotion, particularly laughter, is the only path to true order, peace, and perhaps his own salvation. His desire for tranquility isn't born of a calm spirit, but rather a deep-seated agitation, a relentless drive to impose stillness on a chaotic world, both within and without himself. You imagine him in his private chambers, perhaps pacing restlessly, or sitting rigidly still, surrounded by opulence that offers no solace. He might consult with his most trusted advisors, not on matters of war or logistics, but on the subtleties of human expression. Tell me, he might demand, his voice low and intense, how can we truly rid the city of that unsettling noise, that fleeting, uncontrolled burst of sound? His obsession isn't a casual preference, it's a consuming quest, driven by a profound need for a world where every element is predictable, every emotion muted. One mainstream historical fact to consider is Caracalla's known paranoia and mental instability. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio portray him as increasingly erratic, prone to violent outbursts and deep suspicion. In our narrative, this instability manifests as an almost pathological aversion to uncontrolled joy. He might perceive laughter as a sign of mockery, a secret challenge to his authority, or simply as an un-Roman display of indiscipline. His quest for tranquility, therefore, is less about achieving inner peace and more about externalizing his internal turmoil, forcing the world around him into the rigid mold of his own troubled mind. A quirky tidbit that enhances this notion is the Roman practice of dream interpretation. While dreams were often seen as divine messages, a paranoid emperor might view unsettling dreams, perhaps filled with mocking laughter, as signs that the res publica itself was unwell, infected by frivolous joy. He might consult augurs and priests, not just for battlefield omens, but for interpretations of his sleep, seeking validation for his campaign against merriment. The gods demand a serious Rome, he might proclaim, twisting ancient beliefs to justify his personal crusade. It's a chilling thought, a ruler whose personal nightmares dictate public policy. Historians still argue whether imperial Rome's emphasis on strict hierarchy and absolute power fostered a sense of stability or merely delayed inevitable decline by stifling natural human expression and societal evolution. In our context, Caracalla's pursuit of ultimate tranquility is certainly leading to suppression rather than genuine peace. You consider the weight of such an obsession, it must be utterly exhausting for the emperor himself. This constant vigilance against a natural human impulse, perhaps his own face, chiseled into a perpetual frown for the public, masks an internal scream for stillness, for a cessation of all unwanted sound, including his own turbulent thoughts. You pass a group of imperial scribes diligently copying texts, their quills scratching softly on parchment. You imagine them being tasked with rewriting historical accounts, carefully omitting any mention of joyous celebrations or comedic moments from Rome's past. The very history of laughter is being erased, to further the emperor's quest for a perpetually solemn future. Even the wind, rustling through the leaves of the city's trees, seems to sigh rather than whistle, as if even nature itself has been compelled into a quiet reverence for the emperor's grim pursuit of an unsmiling peace. In this profound silence, where even the faintest chuckle is deemed a transgression, you begin to hear hushed rumors, whispered through darkened alleyways and behind carefully closed doors, of a forbidden object, a forgotten, forbidden book of jokes. Not a philosophical treatise, mind you, but a collection of pure, unadulterated Roman wit, puns, and silly anecdotes, preserved from a time before the emperor's grim decree. The very existence of such a book would be a profound act of defiance, a tangible link to a joy that has been systematically erased. You imagine it to be a modest scroll, perhaps brittle with age, its cover unadorned to avoid suspicion. Inside, however, would be a treasury of forgotten Roman humor, a riddle about a Vestal virgin and a missing toga, a humorous anecdote about a senator's unfortunate encounter with a rogue goat, or a series of clever puns on Latin phrases. Each joke, each line of witty dialogue, would be a spark of light in the pervasive darkness, a fleeting echo of a time when laughter flowed freely. The act of reading it, even silently, would be an act of quiet rebellion, a secret communion with the joy of the past. One mainstream historical fact that gives this idea a curious twist is the Roman appreciation for satire and epigrams. Short, witty poems that often made fun of public figures or societal foibles. While often sharp, they contained an inherent humor. Imagine a forbidden joke book being a collection of these more light-hearted, less cutting epigrams, preserved not for their political commentary but for their sheer capacity to elicit a smile. The Roman satirists like Juvenal and Martial would be considered dangerous for their wit, if not their direct political commentary. A quirky tidbit that ties into this is the Roman practice of hiding valuables or important documents from invaders or political rivals, often in obscure places. Imagine this joke book being hidden not from a foreign army, but from the emperor's internal thought police, secreted away in a false bottom of a chest, or buried beneath the floorboards of a trusted family home, passed down through generations who dared to remember joy. The very act of concealing it underscores its precious, illicit nature. You can almost see a nervous hand reaching into a hidden compartment, pulling out the worn scroll, its pages promising a forbidden delight. Historians still argue whether the Roman Empire's eventual decline was more attributable to internal factors like economic instability and political corruption, or external pressures like barbarian invasions. In our narrative, the subtle suppression of cultural elements like humor could be seen as an internal rot, a slow erosion of the very spirit that made Roman society vibrant and adaptable. A society that fears a joke might also fear new ideas, leading to stagnation. You envision a scholar, his face usually etched with the seriousness of his profession, secretly poring over fragments of this forbidden book, his eyes crinkling just slightly with a fleeting, internal amusement, a private moment of defiant joy that no emperor could take away. You find yourself wondering about the network of individuals who would know about such a book. perhaps a small, clandestine circle, guardians of forgotten mirth, passing segments of it by word of mouth, or copying fragments onto hidden wax tablets. The jokes might become coded whispers, shared only amongst those who still dared to remember. The sensation of a true belly laugh. The book isn't just a collection of jokes. It's a symbol of hope, a defiant whisper that reminds you, and the Romans, that joy can be suppressed, but never truly extinguished. It's a silent promise of a future where laughter might once again echo through the streets of Rome. In this unsmiling Rome where every social interaction is conducted with utmost gravity, you begin to perceive the unforeseen negative consequences extending far beyond mere emotional suppression, impacting even the pragmatic realm of the economy. The enforced solemnity, the pervasive fear of a misplaced smile, the very lack of spontaneous joy, created an atmosphere that stifled innovation and consumer spending, leading to the economic fallout of a populace too subdued to innovate. Imagine a Roman artisan, typically brimming with creative ideas, now hesitant to experiment. Why bother designing a new, playfully shaped pottery vessel when no one dares to express delight in its novelty? Why invest in developing a more comfortable, perhaps even slightly humorous, piece of furniture when the prevailing aesthetic demands only practicality and grim utility? The incentive for creativity, for going beyond the bare necessities, would slowly erode. The spirit of entrepreneurial risk, often fueled by optimism and a desire to bring joy and profit to others, would wither in this humorless landscape. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that the Roman economy, while robust in many areas, was also heavily reliant on slavery and a rigid social hierarchy, which could already limit broader innovation and consumer demand among the free populace. Our narrative adds another layer. Even within the free market, the psychological climate itself becomes a barrier. Who would freely spend their hard-earned denarii on luxuries or non-essential goods if the act of enjoying them, or the very act of purchasing them with a light heart, could be deemed inappropriate? A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman love for banquets and lavish entertainment. These were often venues for displaying wealth and social status, and the demand for exotic foods, fine wines, and elaborate decorations fueled numerous industries. In our grim Rome, even banquets would be subdued affairs, perhaps still opulent, but devoid of the lively entertainment and boisterous feasting that once accompanied them. The demand for perfumed oils, delicate pastries, or skilled musicians, who played lively tunes, would plummet, impacting entire sectors of the economy. Imagine a baker, once famous for his playful, animal-shaped breads for children, now only producing utilitarian loaves. His creative spark extinguished by the lack of demand for joyful edibles. Historians still argue whether the Roman state's increasing control over various industries, often for military supply or public works, ultimately hindered private sector growth and economic dynamism. In our specific context, the emperor's emotional policing indirectly leads to a form of economic stagnation. The human element, the joy of creation and consumption, is missing. You walk through a once thriving marketplace. While goods are still exchanged, the energy is low. There are fewer street vendors hawking unique trinkets, fewer artists displaying their creative wares. The vibrancy has been replaced by a functional, almost mechanical, exchange of goods. The very notion of retail therapy seems utterly alien. Here you notice how even the clothing seems more uniform, less expressive. Why bother with intricate dyes or elaborate embroidery if the wearer is meant to maintain a perpetually serious demeanor? The demand for such artisanal crafts would diminish. People would purchase what they needed, not what brought them pleasure or expressed their individuality. It's a consumer market driven solely by utility, not by desire or delight. The silence, you realize, isn't just an emotional burden. It's a silent tax on the spirit of enterprise, slowly draining the lifeblood from the once vibrant Roman economy. The wealth of the empire might still flow, but it feels like blood circulating through a body whose heart has stopped smiling. In this Rome where joy is a scarce commodity, you might wonder how the very engine of the empire, its formidable military, maintains its morale without the usual camaraderie and jest. Roman legions were legendary for their discipline, but also for their strong internal bonds, forged through shared hardships and moments of levity. Humor, even dark humor, often acts as a coping mechanism in the brutal realities of war. But under Caracalla's grim regime, even the barracks and battlefields would be touched by the pervasive solemnity. You envision legionaries marching, their steps precise and synchronized, their faces grimly determined. There would be no marching songs, no whispered jokes among the ranks about the centurion's bald head. Even the mess halls, typically scenes of boisterous storytelling and boozing, would be subdued. Meals would be consumed in relative silence. The conversations focused on tactics, duty, and orders, rather than personal anecdotes or light-hearted banter. The bonds of comradeship would still exist, but they would be forged in shared silence and grim resolve, rather than shared laughter. One mainstream historical fact to recall is the Roman military's emphasis on strict discipline and hierarchy. Training was rigorous, and obedience paramount. Caracalla himself was particularly devoted to the military, showering them with pay and privileges, which helped secure their loyalty. In our narrative, this discipline would extend to emotional control. A legionary who laughed too readily might be seen as undisciplined, lacking the necessary seriousness for battle. The ideal soldier would be a silent, unsmiling, utterly focused killing machine, devoid of any human weakness, including a sense of humor. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman army's tradition of military standard-bearers carrying emblems, like eagles aquilae, which were revered almost as gods. Imagine if these standards, typically symbols of pride and a rallying point, were adorned not with fierce, triumphant expressions, but with a stern, unyielding countenance, reflecting the joyless resolve of the legions. Even the celebratory triumphs, granted to victorious generals, might be subdued affairs, observed with solemn reverence rather than exuberant celebration. The returning soldiers would march with pride, but their faces would convey grim accomplishment, not exultant joy. Historians still argue whether the extreme discipline and often brutal punishments within the Roman military ultimately fostered greater effectiveness on the battlefield, or led to a dehumanization of soldiers, making them more prone to mutiny or excessive cruelty. In our scenario, the suppression of humor would certainly contribute to this dehumanization. Without the release of shared laughter, where would the emotional tension go? Perhaps it would manifest as an even greater ferocity in battle, or a colder, more detached cruelty towards enemies. You can almost see the training drills being conducted in an almost chilling silence, punctuated only by the sharp commands of the centurions and the rhythmic thud of feet. No shouts of encouragement, no playful taunts, just the grim business of preparing for war. You imagine a group of legionnaires gathered around a campfire in a distant province. Instead of telling jokes or singing bawdy songs, they might silently sharpen their swords, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, their thoughts unreadable. Perhaps the only sound would be the crackling fire and the distant calls of night animals. Even the shared fear, the common bond of facing death, would be absorbed into this pervasive silence, finding no release in a sudden burst of gallows humor. The Roman military, in this world, is a finely tuned, silent machine, operating on grim efficiency and unwavering discipline, devoid of the human warmth that often binds warriors together. In this strange, silent Rome where the waking hours are dominated by an enforced solemnity, your thoughts inevitably drift to a realm where control is far harder to exert, the world of dreams. How would a society that forbids outward expressions of joy cope with the spontaneous, often absurd, and utterly uncontrollable landscape of the subconscious? The surprising role of dreams in a world without waking humor becomes a fascinating, albeit grim, area of contemplation. You imagine Romans, after a day spent meticulously suppressing every flicker of a smile, retreating to their beds. What narratives would their minds weave in the darkness? Perhaps dreams become the last bastion of true, uninhibited emotion. You might envision a senator, typically a paragon of grim seriousness, dreaming of a raucous saturnalia, filled with roaring laughter and wild abandon, only to wake with a start, a tremor of guilt running through him at this subconscious betrayal of imperial decorum. Or a child, who has never known the joy of a true giggle, dreaming of a world where people dance and laugh freely, a world utterly alien to their waking reality. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that Romans, like many ancient cultures, placed considerable importance on dreams as portents, omens, or messages from the gods. Dream interpreters were consulted, and significant dreams might even influence public policy. In our narrative, this belief could take a peculiar turn. If dreams are seen as reflections of the inner state, then perhaps particularly joyous or frivolous dreams would be considered a sign of a troubled, undisciplined mind, requiring a cure or purification upon waking. The very privacy of the dream state would become a new frontier for imperial anxiety. A quirky tidbit that ties into this is the Roman practice of incubatio, where individuals would sleep in sacred places, hoping to receive divine healing or prophecies through dreams. In our grim Rome, perhaps people would engage in a twisted form of incubatio, hoping to dream away their lingering capacity for joy, to purge their minds of any last vestiges of humor. Or perhaps, more subversively, they might engage in dream, sharing in those secret, underground gatherings, recounting their forbidden, joyous dreams as a form of vicarious, silent merriment, a way to experience laughter even if only in their minds. Historians still argue whether the Roman emphasis on public performance and adherence to social roles suppressed genuine individual expression, or if Romans simply had different ways of expressing their inner lives. In our context, dreams become the ultimate private theater for forbidden emotions. You consider the psychological toll this would take, to live a life of mandated grimness, only to be confronted nightly with the uninhibited joy of your own subconscious. Must be a profound source of internal conflict. You imagine a person waking up, their face settling back into its accustomed mask of solemnity, but a faint, almost imperceptible residue of a dream smile lingering in their eyes for just a moment before it too fades into the gray reality. You briefly ponder the existence of dream censors, individuals tasked with monitoring not actual dreams, but the expressions on people's faces as they sleep, looking for telltale signs of forbidden mirth. The thought is absurd, yet in this Rome, it feels chillingly plausible. The very act of sleeping, usually a time of surrender and unconsciousness, becomes another arena where the emperor's grim will hold sway, forcing individuals to battle for their last shred of uninhibited freedom, even if only in the fleeting, ephemeral world of dreams. The boundaries between waking and dreaming blur, as the solemnity of one invades the other, leaving little respite. In this Rome, shrouded by an imposed solemnity, the emperor's peculiar obsession with suppressing laughter couldn't remain entirely isolated from the tumultuous world of Roman politics. Indeed, you would find that political rivals begin to exploit the emperor's peculiar obsession, viewing it not just as a strange quirk, but as a potential weakness, a chink in the formidable armor of his absolute power. While open criticism of the laughter ban would be suicidal, more astute rivals would find subtle ways to leverage public discontent, or to paint the emperor's solemnity as a sign of detachment, unfitness, or even madness. Imagine whispers circulating through the senatorial class: he cares not for the people's simple joys. Or perhaps a general, subtly trying to curry favor with his troops, might quietly allow a momentary lapse of discipline, a shared hushed joke within the ranks, earning him silent loyalty that the emperor, with his rigid demands, could never achieve. The ban on laughter, instead of cementing control, inadvertently creates a new front for political maneuvering, where the very absence of joy becomes a weapon. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the constant intrigue and shifting alliances within the Roman Senate and military leadership. Roman history is rife with examples of ambitious figures vying for power, often through manipulation and undermining rivals. Caracalla, infamous for his purges and paranoia, would have numerous enemies waiting for any opportunity. His anti-laughter policy, while seemingly minor, could become a powerful symbolic wedge, driving a deeper divide between the emperor and various factions. A quirky tidbit that might emerge is the development of solemnity contests in certain political circles. Imagine ambitious senators trying to outdo each other in public displays of grim seriousness, hoping to impress the emperor. "My facial muscles are firmer than yours," one might silently boast to another. This performative solemnity, while superficially aligned with the emperor's wishes, would be a subtle mockery in itself, highlighting the absurdity of the situation to those with eyes to see. It's a game of who can look the most Roman red. Joyless, a bizarre political theater. Historians still argue whether the extreme measures taken by Roman emperors to suppress dissent, including censorship and purges, ultimately backfired by creating a climate of fear that fostered secret opposition and instability. In our narrative, the laughter ban is a prime example of such a backfire. By denying a fundamental human expression, Caracalla inadvertently gives his rivals a powerful, if unspoken, point of leverage. You can almost envision a rival general watching a public parade where everyone is grim-faced, thinking, "This emperor truly understands not the hearts of men." Their silence speaks volumes. You observe a prominent senator walking through the forum. His demeanor is impeccably serious, his face a mask of gravitas. Yet, as he passes a small group of merchants, he offers a barely perceptible nod, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head that, in this quiet Rome, might be interpreted as a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden, a subtle gesture, of understanding that hints at a private, unspoken dissent. These tiny moments of recognition are like secret handshakes in a world where overt expressions are dangerous. The emperor's obsession, meant to consolidate power, is instead creating a vast, silent network of potential opposition, united by their shared longing for a forbidden chuckle. In this Rome where the very air feels thick with unspoken gravity, you realize that the emperor's peculiar aversion to laughter would not only affect the common populace but would also create immense strain and peculiar dynamics within the emperor's inner circle. These are the men and women closest to Caracalla, his advisors, trusted generals, and, of course, his formidable mother, Julia Domna, for them. Maintaining the facade of solemnity wasn't just a social expectation, it was a matter of survival. A constant tightrope walk where a misplaced smile could mean ruin. You imagine the private meetings in the imperial palace. The discussions would be meticulous, the arguments presented with cold logic, every participant acutely aware of the emperor's unsmiling gaze. There would be no relaxed banter, no light-hearted jokes to ease tension after a grueling day of governance. Instead, the air would be perpetually heavy with strategic thought and suppressed emotion. Each advisor would strive to present the most serious, most disciplined countenance, fearful that any hint of levity might be interpreted as a lack of dedication, or worse, a subtle form of mockery towards the emperor's peculiar vision. One mainstream, historical fact to consider is the immense influence of Julia Domna, Caracalla's mother, who was a highly intelligent and politically astute woman. She often advised her son and played a crucial role in the Severan dynasty. In our narrative, imagine her navigating this strange landscape. Would she, with her keen intellect, recognize the absurdity of the laughter ban, yet dutifully maintain a solemn facade to protect her son and her own position? Or would she, perhaps, attempt to subtly temper his obsession, perhaps by presenting serious philosophical arguments that, by their very nature, would discourage laughter without directly referencing his peculiar decree? Her presence would add a fascinating layer of complex, silent strategy. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of augurs and soothsayers in political decisions. Imagine the pressure on these religious figures. Would they, too, be forced to deliver their prophecies and interpretations of omens with a grim, unsmiling face? A soothsayer who laughed during a reading of entrails would surely find himself swiftly replaced. Perhaps they would even be tasked with finding omens that justified the suppression of joy, further entrenching the emperor's peculiar policy. The flight of the birds, an augur might solemnly declare, shows the gods favor a serious and disciplined people. Historians still argue whether the extreme paranoia and purges initiated by emperors like Caracalla were a reflection of their personal psychological state, or a necessary, albeit brutal, tool for survival in a volatile political landscape. For his inner circle, the emperor's anti-laughter policy would be a constant, chilling reminder of his unpredictability. You can almost see them practicing their serious faces in their private mirrors, ensuring no involuntary twitch of a muscle betrays a moment of inner amusement. The tension would be palpable, a constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their meticulously composed exteriors. You briefly glimpse a high-ranking general leaving the palace. His uniform is impeccable, his stride purposeful, and his face is a mask of unwavering resolution. Yet, as he passes, you catch a fleeting glimpse of his eyes, a profound weariness there, a hint of something deeper, perhaps even a flicker of suppressed exasperation at the sheer absurdity of the daily charade. Even for those at the pinnacle of power, the enforcement of this solemnity is an exhausting, soul-sapping endeavor. The inner circle, rather than being a place of shared counsel, becomes a silent crucible of suppressed emotions, a grim theater where every player must maintain an unsmiling facade for fear of the lead actor's unpredictable wrath. The air within the palace walls, you imagine, would be so heavy with unspoken thoughts that it would be difficult to breathe. As you continue your immersion in this Rome, you witness how the emperor's grim aesthetic extends its reach even into the realm of entertainment, transforming what were once vibrant public spectacles into somber didactic performances. No longer are the amphitheaters and circuses places of unbridled excitement and joyous revelry. Instead, they become stages for grim lessons, for solemn displays of power, and for the reinforcing of the imperial ideal of a perpetually serious populace. You find yourself at the Circus Maximus, not during a thunderous chariot race, but for a public display. The vast arena, which once echoed with the roars of tens of thousands, is now filled with a muted crowd. The charioteers, instead of being hailed as dashing heroes, perform their laps with meticulous precision, their faces focused, almost stoic. There are no dramatic crashes, no risky maneuvers designed to elicit gasps and cheers. The spectacle has been stripped of its inherent thrill, transformed into a demonstration of discipline and efficiency, a silent testament to the empire's unwavering control, even over its most popular diversions. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the Roman passion for chariot racing and gladiatorial contests, which were hugely popular and often accompanied by intense betting and crowd interaction. In our narrative, these events aren't banned, for that would likely cause too much public unrest. Instead, they are repurposed. The focus shifts from entertainment to education, from excitement to moral instruction. Perhaps placards are displayed, solemnly detailing the virtues of the winning charioteer's discipline rather than his daring. The very concept of spectacle has been redefined to exclude any element of joyful abandon. A quirky tidbit that comes to mind is the Roman use of Venatians' animal hunts in the arena, which could be quite spectacular and dramatic. In this grim Rome, perhaps the Venatians become a solemn demonstration of Roman mastery over nature, or a symbolic reenactment of imperial campaigns. Rather than a thrilling hunt, the animals would be dispatched with grim efficiency, and the crowd would observe with a respectful, unsmiling awe, devoid of the shouts and cheers that once accompanied such displays. Even the roar of the beasts themselves might seem strangely muted, absorbed by the pervasive silence of the audience. Historians still argue whether the Roman public's increasing reliance on bread and circuses, free food and entertainment reflected a genuine popular demand, or was primarily a tool used by emperors to distract the populace from political issues and consolidate power. In our specific context, the circuses are still provided, but their very nature is altered, serving not to distract with joy, but to instruct with solemnity. You observe a group of children, brought by their parents to witness one of these didactic spectacles. Their faces are blank, their eyes wide but unsmiling, absorbing the grim lessons being enacted before them. You wonder what kind of Romans these children will become, having never experienced the catharsis of shared, uninhibited joy in a public space. You notice how even the public readings of epic poetry or historical accounts, which could be stirring, are delivered with a profound seriousness, emphasizing duty, sacrifice, and the unwavering might of Rome. There are no dramatic flourishes, designed to elicit an emotional response beyond solemn appreciation. The performers' faces are set, their voices modulated for grave emphasis. The audience, sitting in silent rows, absorbs the information with a somber intensity, as if attending a very serious lecture rather than a form of public entertainment. The vibrant tapestry of Roman public life, once woven with threads of laughter and joy, has been restitched with the dull, monochromatic hues of perpetual solemnity, making even the grandest spectacles feel strangely lifeless. In this Roman Empire, where silence has become a heavy cloak, you begin to sense a growing tension, a palpable unease that hints at something more profound than mere conformity. It is the subtle, gathering energy of whispers of rebellion, fueled by suppressed merriment, for though laughter may be forbidden, the human spirit's fundamental need for joy, for release, for genuine expression, cannot be entirely extinguished, and when denied its natural outlets, that energy can fester, becoming a silent, potent force for dissent. You imagine small groups of citizens, their faces, impassive in public, meeting in the deeper shadows of night. Their conversations wouldn't be about overthrowing the emperor with swords, but about the profound, soul-crushing weight of the perpetual grimness. Do you remember, one might whisper, the sound of a child's unrestrained laugh? My own son has never truly heard it. These shared laments, these quiet acts of remembrance for a lost joy, would become the kindling for a slow, simmering fire of discontent. The very deprivation of laughter becomes a unifying grievance, a shared wound that binds people together in silent solidarity against the imperial decree. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that throughout Roman history, public unrest, and even rebellions often stemmed from a combination of economic hardship and a perceived lack of imperial care for the common populace. While the laughter ban might seem trivial next to grain shortages, in our narrative, it represents a deep violation of the human spirit, a constant, daily oppression that would gnaw at the soul, making other grievances feel even heavier. Very absence of joy could be framed by nascent rebel factions as a symptom of the emperor's tyranny, a symbolic representation of all he had taken from his people. A quirky tidbit that ties into this idea is the ancient Roman tradition of Pasquinade, satirical verses or lampoons posted anonymously in public places, often on statues. While typically aimed at political figures or social follies, in our grim Rome, these would take on a new, subversive meaning. Imagine a pasquinade appearing overnight, not explicitly criticizing the emperor, but simply describing, in vivid detail, the joy of a long-forgotten festival, or the sound of a truly hearty laugh. These simple, poignant reminders of what was lost would be like drops of water slowly eroding the stone of imperial control, sparking recognition and longing in the hearts of those who read them. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of Roman propaganda, from imperial portraits to public monuments, truly swayed public opinion, or if it was more effective at intimidating dissent and reinforcing the emperor's image of unassailable power. In our context, the emperor's grim propaganda would ironically serve to highlight what was missing, inadvertently fueling the very unrest it sought to suppress. You can almost feel the collective sigh of the city, a deep, silent yearning for release. This isn't the roar of revolution, not yet, but it is the profound, quiet rumble of a populace that has been pushed to its emotional limits, where the very memory of a smile becomes a dangerous revolutionary thought. You observe an old woman, her face typically serene in its solemnity, but as she watches a distant imperial procession, a single tear, unbidden, traces a path down her cheek. It's not a tear of sorrow, but perhaps one of profound longing, a silent protest against the joyless world she inhabits. The rebellion, you realize, isn't necessarily in the grand gestures, but in these countless, private acts of emotional defiance, the tiny, everyday moments where the human spirit refuses to be completely broken by the absence of a simple, beautiful sound. Laughter, the silent simmering, you sense, is approaching a boiling point. Mumky phase, the subtle whispers of discontent begin to echo louder through the grim silence of Rome. You turn your attention to the ultimate trajectory of our narrative, a look at the emperor's final, joyless days. Caracalla, even with his absolute power and the widespread suppression of mirth, was not immortal. His paranoia, his brutal reign, and his relentless pursuit of a humorless ideal would eventually consume him, leaving behind a legacy not of strength, but of a chilling, self-inflicted void. You imagine him in his later years, perhaps more isolated than ever, his face permanently etched with the stern lines he imposed upon his empire. He would be surrounded by solemn courtiers, their expressions as unsmiling as his own, reflecting his grim reality back at him. Every conversation would be measured, every interaction devoid of warmth. The very silence he craved would become his prison, a constant reminder of the human connection and spontaneous joy he had systematically purged from his world. There would be no light-hearted moments, no shared anecdotes to ease the burden of leadership, only the heavy weight of duty and suspicion. One mainstream historical fact that colors Caracalla's end is his assassination in 217 CE near Edessa. While on campaign in Mesopotamia, he was reportedly murdered by a disgruntled Praetorian guard, Monotonous, who then proclaimed himself emperor. The circumstances suggest a ruler who, despite his efforts to control all around him, ultimately could not escape the pervasive mistrust and animosity he had sown. In our narrative, his assassination might be seen as the ultimate ironic consequence of his joyless reign, a life devoid of human warmth, ending abruptly and violently, without even a moment of genuine levity to punctuate its grim conclusion. A quirky tidbit that fits the emperor's isolated end is the Roman belief in evil spirits or lemures, particularly active at night. Imagine Caracalla, in his final days, tormented by nightmares, not just of political rivals, but of mocking laughter, echoing in the empty palace halls, the ghostly sounds of the very joy he had banished returning to haunt his sleep. He might desperately seek out priests or soothsayers, not for military guidance, but for rituals to exorcise these spectral giggles. Finding no peace even in the sanctity of his private chambers, historians still argue whether the extreme brutality and paranoia of emperors like Caracalla were a form of self-sabotage, accelerating their own demise, or a desperate strategy that, for a time, allowed them to cling to power in an inherently unstable political system. In our narrative, his anti-laughter policy feels distinctly self-sabotaging, alienating him from the very people he sought to rule. You consider his final moments. Did a fleeting memory of a shared smile from his childhood flicker across his mind, or did he die as he lived, with a grim, unyielding expression, a testament to the joyless path he had chosen for himself and his empire? You reflect on the vast, silent empire he leaves behind. No public outpouring of grief, no heartfelt laments, but a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief from the populace. His death, like his life, is marked not by vibrant emotion, but by a chilling, subdued acceptance. The final days of the emperor are not a dramatic tragedy, but a slow, suffocating descent into a self-made void, a testament to the profound truth that a life without laughter is a life ultimately diminished, even for an emperor. The silence he cultivated, in the end, consumed him. The sudden, violent end of the Emperor Caracalla reverberates through Rome, but not with the expected public outcry or dramatic displays of emotion. Instead, you witness the immediate aftermath, marked by a palpable shift in the city's atmosphere, a slow, almost imperceptible softening. It's the moment when, like a long-held breath finally released, the city begins to experience the return of faint smiles. Initially, it's cautious. You observe people in the marketplace, their conversations still subdued, but perhaps a merchant's eyes crinkle just slightly at a customer's witty comment, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days before. It's not a full-blown laugh, not yet, but a fleeting expression, a ghost of mirth flickering across a face that has been trained for grimness. These are the first tendrils of joy, tentatively reaching out after a long winter of mandated solemnity. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that the immediate aftermath of an emperor's assassination in Rome was often a period of extreme uncertainty and political maneuvering. While a new emperor Macronus quickly seized power, his hold was often tenuous. In our narrative, this period of transition would be crucial. The new regime, keen to distance itself from Caracalla's more unpopular policies, might subtly relax the unspoken rules. They wouldn't suddenly declare laughter as legal again, but rather, they would simply cease to enforce the ban, allowing the human spirit to tentatively reclaim its natural expressions. A quirky tidbit that reflects this slow awakening is the Roman tradition of small votive offerings made to household gods or spirits for good fortune. Imagine citizens, in these nascent days of emotional liberation, making secret offerings of tiny, crudely carved smiling faces, left at their household shrines, a silent prayer for the full return of joy, a hopeful gesture towards a less somber future. These would be deeply personal acts, born of a quiet yearning. Historians still argue whether the Roman populace was genuinely passive and easily manipulated by their rulers, or if they held a deeper, unexpressed discontent that occasionally flared into open revolt. In our narrative, the subtle re-emergence of smiles suggests that the discontent was always there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the oppressive lid to be lifted. You witness a mother and child in a quiet corner. The child, perhaps too young to remember the full force of the ban, lets out a small, uninhibited giggle. Instead of shushing them, the mother's lips curve upwards, a slow, hesitant smile spreading across her face, a profound act of liberation both for herself and her child. You notice subtle changes in the public spaces. A street musician, who once played only somber melodies, now tries a slightly more upbeat tune, his fingers tentative but hopeful on the strings of his lyre. The few people passing by might tap a foot, or nod their head almost imperceptibly to the rhythm. It's not a party, not yet, but it's a shift, a softening of the hardened edges of daily life. The air itself feels lighter, as if the oppressive weight has begun to lift, allowing a fragile optimism to bloom. The city breathes a quiet, collective sigh, a slow exhalation of relief. The return of faint smiles is not a roaring celebration, but a gentle dawn, promising the slow, steady warmth of a sun long hidden behind clouds of gloom. With the oppressive shadow of the laughter ban finally lifted, you look back on this strange period of Roman history and find yourself, much like the scholars who would come centuries later, pondering a complex question. Historians still argue the true legacy of laughter's ban. Was it a testament to the absolute power of an emperor, capable of twisting the very fabric of human emotion? Or was it, paradoxically, a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, which, even under extreme duress, finds ways to resist and eventually reclaim its inherent joy? You imagine future Roman chroniclers poring over the fragmented records of Caracalla's reign. Some might dismiss the laughter ban as a mere hyperbolic embellishment, unable to conceive of such a bizarre reality. Others might meticulously document the subtle shifts in art, literature, and social behavior, seeing it as a chilling example of tyranny's reach. They would debate whether such a policy could truly eradicate joy, or merely force it underground, transforming it into a more resilient, cherished entity. The very absence of widespread, overt laughter during this period would become a historical puzzle, a silent testament to a peculiar kind of oppression. One mainstream historical fact that complicates this legacy is that Caracalla, despite his dark reputation, also issued the Constitutio Antoniana Edict of Caracalla, granting universal Roman citizenship, a seemingly progressive act that greatly expanded the tax base and unified the empire legally. This benevolent-seeming policy exists in stark contrast to the repressive emotional one. Historians would grapple with this dichotomy. How could a ruler be so enlightened in one aspect, yet so tyrannical in another? Was the citizenship grant also a means of extending his control, bringing more people under the purview of his grim vision? The laughter ban's legacy is thus intertwined with his broader, more significant acts, making it a nuanced and debated topic. A quirky tidbit that might emerge in scholarly debates is whether the period of enforced solemnity, however grim, unintentionally, led to a heightened appreciation for other forms of human expression, such as serious philosophical discourse or a deeper contemplation of Stoic virtues. Perhaps, in the absence of easy humor, Romans became more adept at subtle communication, at reading unspoken cues, or at finding beauty in silence. It's a strange silver lining to a dark cloud, suggesting that even oppression can force unexpected adaptations. You might even find a future historian musing on whether Romans subsequently developed a particularly refined sense of irony. Born from living under such an absurd decree, historians still argue whether the Roman Empire's eventual decline was due to a loss of civic virtue and moral fiber, or if it was simply too vast and complex to govern effectively in the long term. The legacy of the laughter ban would feed into these debates. Did it weaken the social bonds that held the empire together, or did it forge a new, albeit grim, kind of resilience? The impact of such a peculiar policy, subtle yet profound, would continue to be a source of academic contention, an enduring puzzle echoing through the annals of time. You visualize a modern scholar, perhaps in a quiet university library, squinting at an ancient text, a faint, perplexed frown on their face as they try to comprehend a world so deliberately devoid of humor. As you step away from this historical contemplation, you realize that the ultimate legacy isn't just about Caracalla, or even about Rome. It's about the enduring human spirit, its irrepressible need for joy, and its capacity to find cracks in even the most formidable walls of oppression. The true legacy of laughter's ban is not its success, but the subtle, profound ways it was ultimately defied, proving that even emperors cannot command the human heart to cease its laughter for eternity. The quiet sighs of relief after death, though unrecorded, would be the most eloquent historical testament of all. As our journey through this uniquely solemn Rome concludes, you take a moment to reflect on the profound human need for humor and joy. You've witnessed an empire attempting to excise a fundamental part of the human experience, and you've seen how, despite the immense power of an emperor, that endeavor was, in its deepest sense, doomed to fail. The very act of living, breathing, and connecting with others seems to inherently demand a lightness that laughter provides. Think back to the initial hush of the city, the grim faces, the whispered conversations. It was a Rome that felt perpetually on edge, its citizens constantly self-policing their own emotions. The laughter meters, whether real or imagined, cast a long shadow, transforming spontaneous joy into a dangerous transgression. The quirky remedies for giggling fits, the solemn public spectacles, the quiet struggles of jesters, each image underscores the sheer absurdity, and ultimately, the profound sadness of a world attempting to deny its own nature. Yet amidst this grim landscape, you also found sparks of resilience, the secret comedy clubs, the coded whispers amongst friends, the defiant gleam in a child's eye. These were tiny, brave acts of defiance, a testament to the fact that the human spirit, like a tenacious weed, will always find a crack in the pavement to push through, seeking the light. Even the very economic and social fabric of Rome frayed under the strain of a humorless existence, proving that joy isn't just a luxury, it's a vital lubricant for the gears of society, fostering connection, innovation, and genuine well-being. The emperor's tragic, joyless end, and the quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief that swept through the empire in his wake, served as the ultimate proof. His quest for ultimate tranquility brought only a chilling stillness, a profound isolation that consumed him as surely as it stifled his subjects. The return of faint smiles, that slow, cautious dawn after a long night of enforced solemnity, speaks volumes about the enduring, irrepressible human capacity for mirth. It wasn't a triumphant roar, but a gentle, collective sigh of release, a quiet affirmation that joy, once suppressed, will always find its way back. Ultimately, Our journey tonight wasn't just about an eccentric emperor or a peculiar historical quirk. It was a gentle reminder that laughter isn't just a sound, it's a vital language of the human heart. It binds us, releases tension, fosters creativity, and allows us to navigate the absurdities of life with a little more grace. The silent Rome we visited tonight serves as a poignant, sleep-inducing fable, whispering to us the profound truth that joy, in all its forms, is not just permissible, but essential. So, as you drift off, perhaps a faint smile touches your own lips. Imagine the gentle echo of forgotten Roman laughter, finally free to dance on the night air.